It's been nearly 20 years since this happened, but I still remember that night as though I'm walking back through those dim corridors right now. It was the spring of 2005, and I was working the night shift at a well-regarded children's hospital. I'd been on staff for a couple of years then, primarily in the pediatric oncology ward. If you're not familiar with that environment, it's both one of the most hopeful and most heart-wrenching places in the world. The children there are so resilient, so courageous in the face of terrible odds. The nurses and doctors do everything they can to keep spirits high. That's why the hospital administration had recently hired a professional clown to come in once a week, usually late mornings into the early afternoons, to visit the wards, crack silly jokes, twist balloon animals, and brighten the kids' days. I remember seeing him a few times. The official clown wore a crisp, starched costume, blue and yellow, and a carefully painted face. He had a gentle, well-practiced smile and a calm demeanor. The kids adored him, and the parents appreciated anything that made the hospital feel less like a place of suffering and more like a place of care. But we never saw him outside his scheduled hours. He'd come in at 11 a.m., leave around 2 p.m., and that was that. Until one night, when a fellow nurse mentioned she'd seen the clown after 10 p.m. I laughed at first, assuming she must have been mistaken. Maybe it was a new staff member wearing bright scrubs, or maybe she'd caught a glimpse of someone pushing one of those colorful carts people sometimes use to transport entertainment supplies. But she shook her head, her face pale. "No," she said firmly. "It was him, the wig, the paint, everything." That laugh stuck in my throat. Soon I started hearing more stories. Another nurse swore she saw the clown at the end of a hallway at midnight. She described him as just standing there quietly, not performing, not interacting with anyone. When she called out to ask if he needed help, he turned a corner and disappeared. A respiratory therapist claimed she saw him peeking into a patient's room in the ICU around 2 a.m. "He just stood there for a second," she said. "Then he hurried off as soon as he saw me coming." At first, I dismissed these reports as exhaustion-induced hallucinations. We were all overworked, and night shifts, especially in a children's hospital, can be emotionally draining. Fatigue can make shadows move where they shouldn't. But the stories kept piling up, and with each retelling, I felt my unease growing like a slow, tightening knot in my stomach. There was something off about these sightings, something none of us could quite name. A few nights later, I picked up an overtime shift and found myself alone on rounds in the early, quiet hours. The hospital at night has a strange, heavy stillness to it. The lights are dimmed to a soft yellow haze. Footsteps echo too loud in the emptiness, and the only sounds are the hum of ventilators and the steady, rhythmic beeping of monitors. It was around 3 a.m. when I noticed it. A faint glow spilled out from beneath the door of an old storage room down the hall. Normally, that room stayed locked. It housed outdated equipment and extra medical supplies, and no one had any reason to go in there during the night. My first instinct was to ignore it, probably a janitor or a forgetful doctor. But as I moved closer, that knot in my stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. The hallway seemed colder than it had just moments ago. I stopped outside the door and pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. My pulse thrummed in my neck, and for a moment, I thought about just walking away. But I couldn't. I pushed the door open. The fluorescent light from the hallway spilled in, carving long, pale streaks across the dusty floor. At first, all I saw was shadow. Then, in the far corner, something shifted. A figure, hunched and still, sitting low on a stool. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and the breath caught in my throat. The face turned toward me. White grease paint smeared across sunken cheeks. A gaping red mouth painted too wide, curling at the edges like a cruel, lazy smile. His costume, once bright and starched, was dull and stained, the ruffles around his neck frayed and limp. He didn't move at first, just stared at me with dark, glassy eyes that didn't blink. They weren't friendly or amused. They weren't human. "What are you doing in here?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound firm. My hands gripped the doorframe like it could hold me steady. "You're not supposed to be here." He tilted his head slightly, the motion slow and deliberate, like he was considering my words. Then he muttered something under his breath. The sound was so low and wet, like the faint rustling of leaves, that I couldn't make it out. The stool scraped against the linoleum as he stood. He moved past me, brushing my shoulder. I flinched at the contact, recoiling from the sour, unwashed smell that clung to him. For a moment, I was frozen, too stunned to speak. When I finally snapped out of it and stumbled into the hallway to follow, he was already gone. I ran to the charge nurse's office, breathless and shaking as I described what had happened. She immediately pulled up the staff schedule, confirming what I already knew in my gut. No clown was scheduled that night. No one was supposed to be in costume, period. Her face went pale as she realized something was very, very wrong. We called security, and by morning, we were combing through the grainy black and white footage from the previous nights. There he was, the man I'd seen, appearing on different cameras throughout the hospital. He never walked with purpose. He drifted, slipping from one ward to the next, his movements slow, deliberate, unhurried. Sometimes he hovered near a patient's door, leaning in just enough to listen. Sometimes he loitered at the edges of nurse stations, waiting for the hallways to empty. In one clip, he lingered outside the pediatric oncology ward, staring at the closed door for over 3 minutes without moving. Just staring. We cross-referenced the hired clown schedule. The times didn't match. This imposter had been roaming the hospital for days, possibly longer, wearing just enough of a costume to pass from a distance. What chilled me most wasn't just the footage itself, but the realization that we had no idea what he'd done. He'd gotten close to vulnerable patients, children who couldn't protect themselves. He'd been near staff, families, all of us, and no one had questioned it. No one had stopped him. The police launched an investigation, but there were no leads. His ID badge turned out to be a forgery. His face, without the paint, was unrecognizable. And just like that, he vanished. In the weeks that followed, the hospital tightened security. New locks, more cameras, stricter protocols. But it didn't help me sleep any easier. I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me in that room. The smell of him as he brushed past. Most of all, I couldn't stop asking myself, what was he doing in there? I moved cities a few years later, started a new job, a new life. But I still catch myself glancing into empty corners when I work late. Sometimes, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, certain that I've seen something, a flicker of movement, a flash of white paint, just beyond the edge of my vision. Because here's the thing, that clown didn't need a reason to be there. He didn't need a motive. He was there because we trusted the costume, because we didn't ask. And that's what scares me the most. I've been driving rigs for over a decade now, and I've prided myself on a certain calm. A calm born of long nights on empty interstates, weathering rain, snow, and the occasional roar of passing big rigs. I never considered myself the jumpy type. In fact, I used to tease other drivers about how easily they got rattled by weird roadside encounters or strange folks lingering around gas stations after midnight. But one summer night back in 2015 changed that for me. It changed the way I see those dark stretches of highway forever. It was late August, the kind of humid night where the heat clings to you, even with the windows cracked. I was hauling a standard load through the Midwest on a long, uneventful route through flat farmland and sparse rest stops. Around 2:30 a.m., exhaustion started to hit me. I pulled into a rest area I'd stopped at a few times before. It was the kind of place most truckers avoid unless they're desperate. A lonely, desolate patch of asphalt lit by flickering overhead lights. The vending machines rattled when you used them, the bathroom reeked of mildew, and the nearest town was too far for anyone to care. That night, the lot was empty. Not a single rig parked nearby, no other headlights cutting through the dark. I hesitated for half a second. Truckers always say, "Never stop alone," but I'd been on the road too long, and my eyes felt heavy. I pulled in under a half-dead floodlight, killed the engine, and did a quick sweep of the lot through my mirrors. Nothing. Just the vending machines, a few garbage cans, and the faint shimmer of heat rising off the asphalt. I locked the doors, climbed into the sleeper berth, and kicked off my boots. The quiet wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I told myself I'd rest for a few hours and push on at dawn. I don't think I was out for more than a minute or two before something woke me. A feeling more than a sound. You know that prickling sensation, like someone's watching you. My eyes snapped open, and I stared at the ceiling of the cab, my pulse already quickening. It's nothing, I told myself. Maybe a stray thought or a bad dream I'd already forgotten. Then I saw it. Movement. Just a flicker in my periphery, out past the windshield. I sat up slowly, squinting into the dim light outside. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then, standing under a flickering streetlight at the far edge of the lot, I saw a figure. They were tall, wearing some kind of baggy outfit, and they weren't moving. My first thought was a hitchhiker, or maybe a drifter. But then the light flickered, and I saw their face, white, painted white, with uneven streaks of color that ran like they'd been applied in a hurry, or left to drip in the heat. A clown costume. The shock of frizzy hair looked red, but it was matted, filthy. The colors of the outfit were muted, almost sickly under the fluorescence, and the figure stood perfectly still, like a mannequin dropped in the middle of the parking lot. For a second, I just stared, my groggy brain struggling to process what I was seeing. A prank? Some drunk kid trying to scare people? It wouldn't be the first time I'd seen weirdos out here. I rolled my eyes and shifted back into my bunk. If they came closer, I'd deal with it then. No sense getting worked up over some jackass in a costume, but the unease lingered. Even as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing there, watching. Minutes passed. I might have drifted in and out of a restless doze when I heard it. A faint scrape. It was so light at first, I almost convinced myself it was just the wind. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. Scrape, scrape, scrape. My eyes flew open and my pulse kicked into overdrive. Someone, or something, was outside, dragging something metal along the side of my truck. I sat frozen, holding my breath, straining to listen. Then, summoning every ounce of courage I had, I reached out and flipped on the headlights. The beams flooded the lot, and my stomach dropped. The clown was at my driver's side door, inches from the glass. Up close, the makeup was worse. Smeared red around the mouth, black streaks under the eyes that looked more like bruises. Their chest heaved as they breathed, and in one gloved hand, they held a crowbar. The tip of it had been what I'd heard scraping against my door. For a moment, neither of us moved. They didn't flinch at the light, didn't raise a hand to shield their eyes. They just stared at me, head tilted slightly, unblinking. The glass between us suddenly felt paper thin, and I knew. This wasn't some drunk kid or late-night prank. This was someone with intent. My hands were shaking as I reached for the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the clown's head straightened, their grin widening. I slammed the truck into gear, and as I did, the clown raised the crowbar and brought it down hard against the window. The sound was deafening. The glass shuddered but held. For a split second, I thought it might give, and I'd see that crowbar or those painted hands reaching through to pull me out. Gravel sprayed as I floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing. I kept my eyes on the road, but in the mirror, I caught one last glimpse. The clown stood in the same spot, crowbar at their side, watching me flee. They didn't run after me, didn't even move. They just stood there, a dark silhouette under the flickering light, growing smaller and smaller until the night swallowed them. I didn't stop again. Not at the next rest area. Not at the one after that. I drove until dawn, until I reached a crowded truck stop where the lights were bright and people were everywhere. I parked, sat trembling in my cab, and finally called the local authorities. The dispatcher sounded tired. Too tired. She told me I wasn't the first driver to report something like this. A clown, she said, had been spotted at that rest stop before, lingering near parked cars, scaring drivers, and then vanishing before deputies could arrive. They'd checked the security cameras a dozen times, but all they ever saw was a blurry figure, wandering just out of range. No plates, no leads, just a string of shaken travelers with the same story. I never took that rest area again. Hell, I don't stop anywhere alone if I can help it. And on those long, dark stretches of highway, when the lights flicker and shadows play tricks on my eyes, I still think of that night in 2015. That clown, that crowbar, the sound of the scraping. Now when drivers tell me their late-night horror stories, I don't laugh. I just listen. And I keep driving. Always driving fast. I first noticed something was wrong on a Wednesday afternoon. It was the kind of wrong you can't explain. Not a loud bang or a sudden scream, but a faint whisper, the unsettling feeling of something out of place. I had just trudged home from a long day of classes and my 6-hour library shift, exhausted and eager to collapse into my bed. Haley, my roommate, had left for her nursing rotation at dawn, so I expected the apartment to be just as I'd left it. Quiet, still, unchanged. But as I pushed open the door, I felt it immediately, that wrongness. The air seemed disturbed, heavy, like someone had been there just moments before. I froze in the entryway, scanning the cramped living room and kitchenette for anything unusual. It looked fine, exactly as it should. And yet, my eyes landed on a pair of sneakers by the door. They were turned the wrong way, heels facing out. I always placed them toes out. Always. My stomach tightened, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd been in a rush that morning. Maybe I was imagining things. Still, that tiny shift, so small and meaningless, left an itch in my mind. The apartment was old, cheap. Haley and I had split the rent because it was close to campus and affordable, but it came with its quirks. Thin walls, drafty windows, locks so flimsy you could pick them with a paperclip. I'd never cared much about that. Now I was starting to. Over the next few days, little things kept piling up. My cereal boxes emptied faster than I could remember eating them. Haley denied touching them. She was never home long enough to snack. My bananas bruised, ripened, and disappeared from the counter overnight. Leftovers vanished from the fridge. I told myself I was being paranoid. Stress from school and work was probably making me forget things. But it kept needling at me. One night, lying in bed, I stared at the cracks in my ceiling and replayed every small oddity in my head. Misplaced shoes, moved textbooks, food I swore I hadn't eaten. And then I heard it. It was faint at first, just a light creak of the floorboards. The sound stopped as quickly as it started. My heart slammed against my ribs as I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. Just the hum of the city outside, muffled by the old thin walls. I convinced myself it was the building settling. Or maybe Haley had come home early. I texted her, but she didn't respond. The next morning, I noticed my jacket, the one I almost never wore, hanging slightly crooked in the closet. When I picked it up, the sleeve felt damp. Stale sweat clung to it. By Friday, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed proof, something solid, something to make sense of the growing dread gnawing at my mind. Before leaving for the gym that evening, I carefully arranged my textbooks on the desk in a deliberate offset pattern, one only I would notice if it changed. When I came home, the pattern was ruined. The books were stacked neatly now, almost too neatly. I stared at them, my heart pounding. Someone had been in the apartment. Haley wasn't home, and it wasn't me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound set me on edge. The faint scrape of a branch against the window, the hum of the fridge cycling on. Then, at 2:07 a.m., I woke to something I can only describe as a giggle. Soft, childish. Wrong. My eyes flew open. My bedroom was pitch dark, but I stayed completely still, my body stiff with fear. The sound had come from inside the apartment, somewhere close, maybe even inside my room. For a long, agonizing minute, I held my breath. Nothing. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the glow of the screen almost blinding in the darkness. It made me feel exposed, like a spotlight on a stage. The time confirmed it. 2:07 a.m. And then I heard it again, a muffled, breathy chuckle. This time, I knew exactly where it came from. My closet. The laugh stopped as I swung my legs over the bed, my bare feet pressing into the cold floor. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I needed to know. I needed proof. I grabbed my bedside lamp, flicking it on. Pale yellow light spilled across the room. The closet door stood there, slightly ajar, a thin sliver of black visible through the gap. I took slow, shallow breaths as I moved closer, the handle cool and smooth under my fingers. My body was ice, my heart thundering so loud I was sure it would drown out anything I might hear. I yanked the door open. At first, I thought it was a pile of clothes, just a shadow. But then it shifted. My clothes brushed my arm as something moved. A figure crouched low, half hidden behind the hanging jackets. He wore loose patterned pants and oversized shoes, and on his face, a cheap rubber clown mask, the kind with hollow black eye holes and red painted lips stretched into a frozen grin. He didn't lunge immediately. He just stared at me through the mask, his real eyes darting behind the empty sockets. He looked scared, like an animal caught in a trap. And then he moved. Before I could scream, he bolted forward, shoving past me. I stumbled backward, crashing into my bed. By the time I scrambled to my feet, he was gone. The door to my bedroom swinging wide open, the sound of his heavy footsteps pounding down the hallway. The front door slammed. I locked myself in the bathroom and called 911, shaking so badly I could barely form words. The operator tried to calm me down, but nothing she said could stop the images flashing in my mind. The clown mask, the faint sound of that laugh, the feeling of him crouched in the dark just feet from where I slept. When the police arrived, they found me still in the bathroom, clutching a towel to my chest like it could somehow protect me. They searched the apartment, methodical and quiet. For a while, they found nothing. And then one of them opened the hallway closet. There was a hatch leading up to the attic crawl space. I hadn't even known it was there. When they climbed up, they found his nest. A sleeping bag, crumpled food wrappers, some of my belongings, earrings I thought I'd lost, a photograph of me and Haley. He'd been living above me for weeks, watching me, waiting for me to leave or even to sleep, before creeping down into my space. The police said the attic vent was easy to access from outside. He probably slipped in one night and decided to stay. I moved out as soon as I could, but the damage was already done. Even now, months later, I can't sleep with my bedroom door open. Every creak of floorboards makes my chest tighten. I triple-check locks and still wonder if they're enough. But worst of all, I can't unhear the sound of that giggle. Sometimes, in the dead of night, it comes back to me. Not from the walls or the attic, just from my own memory, like a scar that refuses to heal. And I wonder if he ever left, or if he's just waiting for me to let my guard down. Because the truth is, monsters don't have to be ghosts or demons. They don't need claws or fangs. Sometimes they wear cheap rubber masks, and sometimes all the warning you'll get is a laugh in the dark. In 2012, I was living in a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where time slows down. We had one blinking traffic light, a gas station that doubled as a diner, and an old cemetery perched at the edge of a cornfield. It was quiet, the way small towns are. But by August of that year, the quiet had a strange tension to it. People were whispering about something bizarre, and at first, I brushed it off as small-town gossip. I was 22, working the late shift at a bar a few blocks from the cemetery. Most nights, I'd walk home after closing, enjoying the cool air and empty streets. Then one night, a customer leaned across the counter, eyes darting around the room as if someone might overhear. "You heard about the clown, right?" he whispered. "The what?" I asked, laughing. "The clown," he repeated. "Near the cemetery. People have been seeing him at night." I rolled my eyes, thinking it was just some bored teenager pulling pranks. But over the next few weeks, I heard the same story from half a dozen people, each telling it with a strange seriousness. A clown, dressed in a tattered red and white costume, had been seen standing under the moonlight by the cemetery fence. Sometimes he waved. Sometimes he just stared. He never spoke. No balloons, no boisterous laugh, just a silent figure, pale and still, like he was part of the gravestones themselves. By late September, the stories stopped being funny. It was a Tuesday night when I saw him. I had just finished my shift, and the walk home felt longer than usual. The air was cool, the kind of crisp that makes your breath visible under streetlights. When I reached the curve in the road near the cemetery, I froze. He was there, leaning against the old iron gate, illuminated by the pale silver of the moon. His costume hung loose, as if it didn't quite fit, and his face, painted white with dark, hollow eyes, looked worn, like the grease paint had cracked over time. He raised a gloved hand and waved slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was the kind of wave you'd give a child at a funeral, distant and strange. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the pavement, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, I forced myself to cross to the other side of the street, keeping him in my peripheral vision. He didn't follow. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly, as if curious. By the time I got home, my shirt was damp with sweat. I locked the door and double-checked it, then stood in my dark kitchen for what felt like hours, replaying the moment over and over in my head. The next morning, the whispers around town grew louder. People had seen him again, some at the cemetery, others near their homes. By the end of the week, the rumors had evolved. Fresh flowers and trinkets, porcelain angels, colorful ribbons, had started appearing on certain graves overnight. The police investigated, but there was no evidence of trespassing, no footprints, no disturbed earth, nothing but the items themselves, left in neat arrangements. That's when my friend Mark got involved. Mark was the cemetery's groundskeeper, a gruff guy in his late 30s who hated when people messed with his cemetery. When he started finding small, shallow holes near headstones, patches of freshly turned earth, he lost it. "If I catch whoever's doing this," he said one night over beers, "I'm gonna bury them myself." He wasn't joking. Mark installed a motion-activated camera high in one of the cemetery's oak trees. He didn't tell anyone except me and another friend, Sam. We were curious, morbidly so, and hoped he'd catch something that would finally explain all of this. 2 nights later, Mark called me at dawn. "You need to see this," he said, his voice shaking. I rushed to his house, where he had the footage queued up on his laptop. The timestamp read 2:32 a.m. In the grainy black and white recording, we saw a figure climb the low stone wall bordering the cemetery. It was him, the clown. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like he had all the time in the world. A small satchel was slung over one shoulder. We watched as he knelt by one of the newer graves, pulled out a trowel, and began to dig. After a few minutes, he reached into the satchel and removed something. A dark, indistinct object. He placed it carefully into the hole, patted the dirt back down, and stood. Then he looked directly at the camera. I swear he knew we were watching. His head tilted slightly the way it had when he waved at me, and for a long, terrible moment, he didn't move. He just stared. Then he turned and walked out of frame. We took the footage to the police. They staked out the cemetery for weeks, but never caught him. They even dug into one of the disturbed patches of soil. There was nothing there, no trinkets, no objects, nothing. It was like he'd buried air, or dug something up before leaving. Mark became obsessed. He stayed late every night, patrolling the grounds with a flashlight and a baseball bat. But the clown always seemed to slip through. By October, the visits stopped. No more flowers, no more trinkets. The shallow holes disappeared. It was as if he'd never existed. Mark quit his job the following spring, saying the cemetery didn't feel the same anymore. "It's like the place is holding its breath," he told me once. I never stopped thinking about the clown. A few weeks after his final visit, I decided to see for myself what he was doing. One night, just after 2 a.m., I hid behind a hedge on the far side of the cemetery. The air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own breathing. At 3:12, he appeared. He climbed the wall like he had in the footage, his movements slow and deliberate. He carried the satchel, and when he reached one of the graves, he knelt and began to dig. My heart pounded as I shifted for a better view. I stepped on a twig and the crack was deafening. The clown froze. Slowly, his head lifted, scanning the darkness. I ducked lower, barely daring to breathe. For a moment, I thought he might come closer. My mind raced with possibilities. What would I do if he saw me, if he spoke to me, if he ran at me? But he didn't. After a long pause, he patted the earth down, stood, and vanished into the shadows. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he came. I don't know what he was burying or digging up. The police had no leads, and the town eventually moved on. But I haven't. Real horror doesn't come from ghosts or demons. It comes from the silent, unanswerable mysteries that people carry with them. It's in the quiet places where someone, dressed like a clown, can slip through the darkness, bury secrets we'll never uncover, and vanish without a trace. Even now, when I walk by that cemetery, I catch myself glancing at the fence line, half expecting to see a flash of red and white. I never do, but the memory lingers. Sometimes, I think it always will. I should have listened to my gut the moment I pulled into that hotel's parking lot. It was a small, no-name place off a nearly empty stretch of highway, lit by a buzzing neon sign that kept flickering between vacancy and a half-burnt blur. The air smelled faintly of dust and gasoline as I stepped out of the car, my muscles sore from driving all day after a brutal round of meetings. I just needed a clean bed, a shower, and a few hours of sleep before heading out again at dawn. I remember telling myself, it's just for one night. If only I'd realized how wrong that thought would turn out to be. Inside, the lobby reeked of old wood and stale coffee, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and stays there. A faded rug covered the scuffed floor, and the front desk looked like it hadn't been polished in decades. The man behind it wasn't much better. He had thinning gray hair, watery eyes that flitted anywhere but my face, and the kind of polite but hollow smile that made me feel like I was inconveniencing him. "Room for one?" he asked, his voice dry and gravelly. I nodded, trying not to cringe at how much louder his voice sounded in the too-quiet lobby. He handed me a heavy brass key to room 205 on the second floor. "Need a wake-up call?" "No thanks," I said, already picturing the stale sheets and hoping the shower worked. My skin prickled as I turned to head upstairs, but I brushed it off. I was overtired. Everything felt off when you were this tired. The staircase creaked under my weight, every step echoing up the narrow stairwell like a countdown. On the second floor, the hallway stretched out in dim, flickering light. The carpet was the kind of brownish red that might have once been vibrant but was now worn to a patchy, threadbare map of past footsteps. The doors were all shut. Silent. Too silent. For a moment, I wondered if I might be the only guest here. The thought didn't comfort me. When I slid the key into the lock and opened the door to my room, a musty, sour scent greeted me, like damp carpet left to rot. It wasn't unbearable, but it clawed at the back of my throat. The decor confirmed what I already suspected. The place hadn't been updated since at least the late 80s. Pale floral wallpaper, a scratchy-looking bedspread, and a scuffed dresser. A boxy old TV sat in the corner, its screen dusty. I dropped my bag onto the dresser and reached for the overhead light. That's when I saw it. A clown painting, or what I first thought was a painting, hung on the wall opposite the bed. I froze. Now, I've never been scared of clowns, not really. But something about this one. It wasn't right. It was too large, dominating the wall like it owned the room. The clown wore full makeup, but not the over-the-top kind you'd see at a kid's birthday party. No, this makeup was dingy, smeared in some places, cracked in others, like cheap grease paint applied by someone in a hurry, or by someone who didn't care. Its eyes were the worst part. They weren't cartoonish or exaggerated. They were detailed, too detailed. The longer I stared at them, the more I felt like those eyes were staring back, locked on me, focused. A shiver ran down my spine, sharp and involuntary. Something primal in me whispered, "This is wrong." I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was just a bad piece of art. Creepy, sure, but harmless. I flicked on the TV for some background noise, but the screen buzzed with static. No cable, of course. My skin crawled. The clown painting seemed to loom larger in the corner of my eye, like it was leaning toward me. Watching, I picked up the old-fashioned rotary phone on the nightstand and dialed the front desk. The line crackled, and the old man's voice came through, distant and tinny. Hi, I said, feeling ridiculous. I'm in room 205. I know this is an odd request, but could I switch to another room? There's this clown painting in here, and it's making me uneasy. A long pause. Then, clown painting? His voice sounded confused. We don't have any clown paintings. My mouth went dry. What? It's hanging on the wall in my room. Maybe it's something left over from a previous guest? Another pause. Then he cleared his throat. I can move you, sure. Come down to the desk. I hung up, my hands trembling. I turned back to the painting and felt my heart seize in my chest. The wall was empty. The clown was gone. The entire section of wallpaper where the painting had hung was now bare, faded slightly from years of sun exposure. No frame, no nail, nothing. The blood drained from my face as my pulse roared in my ears. No, 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 no. I wasn't imagining this. I'd seen it. It had been there. I stumbled to the wall, running my hands over it like I'd find some hidden latch or evidence that the painting had been removed. But it was smooth, uninterrupted. I spun around, suddenly convinced I wasn't alone. My eyes darted to the closet, the bed, the shadows in the corners. My breathing came fast and shallow, the walls of the room seeming to close in on me. I grabbed the phone again, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. When the old man picked up, my voice cracked. "Call the police. Something's wrong. Just please call them." He hesitated, his disbelief clear, but something in my voice must have convinced him. He promised to call. I dropped the phone and shoved the desk chair beneath the doorknob, wedging it tight. Then I picked up the heaviest thing I could find, the lamp, and stood in the center of the room, trembling. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. And then I heard it, a faint scraping sound from the hallway. It was so soft at first I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight against the wall just outside the door. My stomach twisted. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. That wasn't a painting. That was a person, standing there watching me. When the knock finally came, 3 hard, rapid pounds accompanied by a muffled, "Police!" I almost collapsed. I scrambled to move the chair and open the door. 2 officers stood there, their expressions sharp with concern. Behind them was the desk clerk, his face pale and drawn. I spilled the story as fast as I could, my words tumbling over each other. At first, the officers seemed skeptical, but when one of them shined a flashlight on the wall adjoining my room, they found it. A loose panel, barely noticeable, concealing a small cutout. The hallway led us to a locked supply closet. Inside, the smell of sweat and grease paint hit me like a slap. There, in the corner, was a pile of filthy clothes, smeared makeup tubes, and a floppy clown wig. The officers exchanged tense looks. Someone had been living there, waiting, watching. I grabbed my things and left as soon as they let me go, driving into the night with one eye on my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until sunrise. I remember that afternoon with stark, unsettling clarity, though I've spent countless nights trying to bury it. It was the spring of 2018, a sunny, perfect day to celebrate my daughter Claire's 7th birthday. Our backyard was a picture of suburban bliss. A dozen children laughing by the hedges, a table weighed down with cupcakes and lemonade, and the air filled with the helium-pitch squeaks of balloons. Claire had begged for a clown to perform, and after some hesitation, we'd hired Bubbles, a performer recommended by a friend, a cheerful, harmless man known for his goofy antics and silly balloon animals. The day seemed perfect in every way, and none of us, not the kids, not the parents, not even me, could have guessed how quickly that illusion would shatter. I can still see it as if I'm floating above the scene. Claire squealing with glee as Bubbles twisted a balloon into a lopsided pony, the parents chatting over lemonade, and the hum of the grill where my husband flipped burgers. It felt safe, perfectly safe. But that's the thing about safety. You never realize how fragile it is until it's gone. I first noticed him at the edge of the lawn, just past the bounce house. He didn't announce himself. He didn't wave or shout or even approach. He just drifted in, like a leaf carried by a breeze. At first I thought he might have been another entertainer, sent by someone as a surprise. But the more I looked at him, the more wrong he seemed. His clown makeup was sloppy, almost haphazard, as though it had been applied in a rush. His red nose sat crooked, and his rainbow wig sagged over his forehead, greasy and unkempt. The white paint on his face had started to streak and crack, as if he'd been sweating or crying. His clothes were no better, mismatched pieces of a clown costume that didn't quite fit. But it wasn't just how he looked. It was the way he moved, slow, deliberate, with an awkward tilt of his head, his shoulders slightly hunched, like he was trying too hard not to seem threatening and failing miserably. He stood there, scanning the children with a sharpness that turned my stomach. It wasn't the gaze of a performer. It was something colder, sharper, hungry. I tried to keep my voice light, friendly. "Hey, who are you?" I called, pasting on a smile I didn't feel. He turned his head slowly, almost mechanically, his dark eyes finding mine. He didn't answer. Instead, one of the kids, David, I think, bounced over to him, delighted at the idea of a second clown. The stranger crouched down, muttered something I couldn't hear, and patted David on the head. The gesture wasn't playful. It was almost clinical, like he was studying him. A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Did someone hire another clown?" my husband asked, stepping closer. I glanced around at the parents, expecting someone to laugh and say, "Surprise." But the only responses were uneasy shrugs and worried glances. No one had invited him. No one knew who he was. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to me. It was to the kids. His voice was low, scratchy, barely audible. "Do you like magic tricks?" he asked a little girl near him. She nodded, wide-eyed. "Do you know your mommy's phone number?" he asked her. My stomach dropped. I moved closer, my smile faltering. "Hey, we weren't expecting you. Who booked you?" I asked, keeping my tone light but firm. He stood slowly and turned to face me, his painted mouth curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "I'm a surprise," he said softly. His voice carried no cheer, no humor, just a flat, cold finality. Someone wanted to make today special. Behind me, the parents were quiet now, their chatter dying as they noticed my body language. I could feel them watching, could feel the tension spreading like a ripple through the party. I forced myself to stand tall, to stay calm. "Well," I said, gesturing toward the gate, "we really didn't plan for another clown. You must have the wrong address." He didn't answer. Instead, he crouched down again, this time in front of my neighbor's daughter, Emily. "Come here," he whispered. "I'll show you a secret trick." His voice had a strange pull to it, soft, almost hypnotic. Emily hesitated, then reached for his hand. Panic surged in my chest. "Wait!" I stepped forward, inserting myself between them. My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Let's keep everyone here in the yard, okay? No wandering off." The clown straightened slowly, his body stiff. For a moment, he just stared at me. Up close, his eyes were even worse than I'd realized. Black and empty, like staring into the bottom of a well. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes," my husband said, stepping up beside me. "You need to leave. Now." The clown's gaze flicked between us, then to the parents, who had begun to close ranks. Even Bubbles had stopped his act, looking on with confusion and concern. "I was the only clown booked today," he said hesitantly, his voice trembling. I don't know who this guy is." The intruder's painted smile faltered for the first time. He seemed to realize he was outnumbered, that no one here believed whatever lie he'd been spinning. He straightened, brushing past me without a word. The kids watched, wide-eyed, as he walked back toward the gate. He didn't rush, didn't apologize. He moved with the same eerie calm as when he arrived, slipping out of the yard like a shadow. At the gate, he paused. For a moment, I thought he might say something. A joke, a name, a twisted apology. But he didn't. He just turned, staring back at us with those hollow eyes. Then he disappeared around the side of the house, and the tension in the yard exploded into panicked murmurs. Claire tugged my arm. "Who was that other clown, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small. I knelt, pulling her into a hug, trying to steady my trembling hands. "Just someone who got the wrong address," I said, forcing a calm tone I didn't feel. The rest of the party passed in a haze. We cut the cake, handed out goodie bags, and thanked the guests for coming, but the joy had drained from the day. The laughter was thinner, the smiles forced. The parents left quickly, casting nervous glances toward the street. That night, after Claire was tucked into bed, we called the police. 2 officers came, taking notes and nodding grimly. We gave them the best description we could: a clown of average height, smeared makeup, mismatched costume, nothing specific enough to track him down. In the days that followed, we posted on neighborhood boards, warned friends, even checked with local performers. But no one had seen him. No one knew who he was. He'd slipped in and out of our lives without leaving a trace, like a ghost. Even now, years later, I can still feel the weight of his presence, like a dark stain on that sunny afternoon. I think about what could have happened if I hadn't been watching, if we hadn't stepped in. People like him don't vanish forever. They wait, blending into the background, looking for another moment, another child, another chance. It's not the skeletons or the animatronic zombies that keep me up at night. It's the human face in the dark, watching silently. Late August of 2017, our family, my wife Karen, our 2 kids, Molly, 6, and Jacob, 9, and I, was grappling with that familiar late summer boredom. The kind where the kids are restless, the days blur together, and you start looking for any excuse to get out of the house. So when the carnival rolled into town, pitched up in a dusty, empty field off the main highway, it felt like fate. It wasn't much to look at. Rickety rides, faded signs, the faint odor of old fryer oil clinging to the air. But it promised funnel cakes, rigged games, and cheap thrills. The kind of small-town charm that's impossible to resist when you're desperate for a distraction. By the time dusk fell, the colored bulbs strung along the tents were glowing, and the crowd was starting to thin. That's when Molly spotted it. A small haunted house attraction tucked away near the far corner of the carnival. "Can we ride it, Daddy?" she asked, tugging at my sleeve. The sign above the entrance swayed in the breeze, its red chipped lettering barely legible. The Chiller. It looked like it had been built in someone's backyard. Sloppy murals of skeletons and witches, plywood walls barely holding together. The kind of place where the screws sticking out might scare you more than the ghosts. Karen raised a skeptical eyebrow at me, and I could tell she wasn't thrilled about it. But Molly was bouncing on her toes, and Jacob chimed in with a casual, "It's not like it's going to be scary." "Fine," Karen said, throwing up her hands. "One last ride before bed." The operator was a bored-looking teenager in a neon vest who barely glanced up as he waved us into the 2-row car. I settled Molly on my lap. She clutched a plush unicorn she'd won earlier, and Jacob slid in next to Karen behind us. The car jolted, the chain clanked, and we were swallowed by darkness. The first chamber smelled like damp cloth and old paint. A flickering black light illuminated fluorescent skeleton drawings that seemed slapped on with no real effort. Molly giggled when a plastic bat brushed against my head, and Jacob leaned back like he was too cool to care. Karen met my gaze in a quick strobe flash, and rolled her eyes. This is what they call scary. Around the first corner, cardboard ghosts sprang out of hidden panels, creaking on their springs. Harmless, almost charming in their amateurishness. We all laughed. It was the kind of ride you'd expect to find at a church fundraiser. But then we turned another corner. That's when we saw him. He was standing there motionless, waiting for us. A clown. At first I thought he was a prop, a mannequin maybe. He wore baggy striped pants, mismatched shoes, and a ruffled collar stained with something dark. His mask wasn't the bright, cartoonish kind you see at kids' parties. It was old-fashioned, cracked porcelain, with deep black paint around the eyes, and red smeared across the mouth in jagged strokes. Then he lunged. He didn't laugh or shout, didn't wave or perform some exaggerated gesture like the cheap animatronics had. He moved fast, jerking toward the car with his arm outstretched. Molly screamed and buried her face in my chest. My heart thudded as I instinctively pulled her closer. He was so close I could have touched him if I'd reached out. And then, just as quickly, he was gone. The car rattled forward into the next chamber. "It's just an actor," I said quickly, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "Just part of the ride." But was it? This was a low-budget carnival, a step above traveling carnies. There was no way they were hiring live performers for a ride this cheap. Jacob muttered. That was creepy. His earlier bravado cracking. Karen said nothing, but her hand clutched the seat bar so tightly her knuckles turned white. The car creaked around another corner. A mechanical skeleton lowered from the ceiling with a groan of cheap hydraulics. Strobe lights flickered again, and in the far corner of the room, I saw him. The clown. He was crouching this time, half hidden behind a wooden beam, his head tilted slightly as if he were studying us. His painted eyes seemed to glint in the erratic light. My stomach flipped. He couldn't have gotten there so fast. Unless... The strobe blinked off, and in the momentary darkness, he vanished. Molly's grip on my arm tightened. She wasn't giggling anymore. Jacob leaned forward, whispering, "Did you see him?" Karen shot me a glance, her expression sharp, like she was daring me to explain. The car creaked onward, the track rattling beneath us. Another turn. Another corridor. This time, there was a gap in the plywood paneling, just a sliver, barely wide enough to see through. But as we passed, I saw him again, his face, framed by the loose boards. He wasn't lunging now. He wasn't moving at all. He was just watching. No jump scare, no carnival laughter. Just silence, broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the soft creak of the ride. When we finally emerged into the night air, I realized I'd been holding my breath. Molly was trembling. Jacob's face was pale. Karen opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. "That actor in there really got us," I said to the teenage attendant at the exit, forcing a laugh to calm my nerves. She frowned. "What actor?" "The clown," Karen said sharply. "The guy inside with the creepy mask." The girl tilted her head. "There's no one in there tonight. It's all automated." The blood drained from my face. "No, I'm telling you," I insisted. "We saw him." She blinked, then muttered, "Let me get my manager," and walked off. We stood there, frozen. I could feel Karen's tension radiating as she whispered, "What the hell was that?" The manager arrived moments later, all flustered. "Probably some prankster," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But his voice wavered. He called over a few workers to check the ride. They didn't take long. One of the men came out, pale as a ghost. "There's a clown costume stuffed behind one of the panels," he said, his voice low. "But it's not one of ours. And there are footprints leading out the back into the woods." The woods loomed just beyond the carnival grounds, a scraggly patch of trees fading into farmland. I stared at the darkness, my pulse hammering. We left in a hurry, clinging to each other, constantly glancing over our shoulders. No one said a word until we were in the car. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't stop picturing the mask, the stillness, the way his head tilted like he was trying to memorize us. We never found out who he was or what he wanted. The police got involved, but the carnival packed up a few days later, and nothing ever came of it. No arrests, no news stories, just silence. Now, whenever I hear about haunted houses or spook rides, I think about the chiller. The carnival comes every year, wheezing through our dead-end town like a traveling sideshow of half-fulfilled promises. Normally, it's chipped paint on wobbling rides, sputtering calliope tunes that never quite form a melody, and stalls hawking cotton candy so sweet it makes your teeth ache. But in a place with boarded windows, potholed streets, and ambitions that rot on the vine, it's the only taste of somewhere else we get. This time, though, something's off from the start. I catch it in the laughter drifting over the fence line before we even step onto the grounds. It's too high, too thin, as if everyone's choking on their own mirth. The smell's wrong, too. Fried dough that's a bit too stale, sugar so thick it turns rancid, and an oily tang of sweat that turns my stomach. Overhead, strings of bulbs flicker, half of them dead, casting jittering shadows that feel alive. I stand next to Jess, who's scanning the carnival with a feigned bravado. She hates clowns, admitted it to me once after too many energy drinks. As a kid, she had a nightmare about one crawling into her crib. She vowed never to show that fear again, so now she grins too wide, chin lifted, as if daring the world to scare her. She's the bold one, the girl who laughs at danger even when her voice cracks. I admire her, but tonight I can sense how tightly she's wound. "Come on," she says, pointing toward a distant tent near the carnival's edge, away from the ring toss and creaking carousel. The tent sags, its canvas drooping like diseased skin. Faded red stripes peel back like scabs. A crooked sign overhead reads, "The Laughing Mile. Enter if you dare." I swallow hard. My father says I overreact, that I see threats in every corner. I try to laugh off my nerves. That's always been my shield. But tonight, my laugh sticks in my throat. "Jess," I say quietly, "maybe we skip this one." She raises an eyebrow. "Don't sound like your dad. We're not leaving. It's $2. She fishes a bill from her pocket. Her hand shakes slightly, and I realize she's as scared as I am. That only makes it worse. I nod, falling into step behind her. The calliope music shifts key, turning sour, as if mocking our decision. We pass a booth where a stuffed animal's face is half melted by a faulty light, and the laughter around us warps into something hollow. I want to run, but I don't. Inside the tent, the air feels thick, as if we've stepped into a giant lung that can't quite exhale. The dim bulbs overhead sway, casting shadows that slither across the canvas. A smell of something rotten and syrupy clings to my tongue like spoiled fruit and old metal. I gag softly, trying to swallow the urge to nervously laugh. Mirrors line the corridor, their surfaces warped and pocked. Our reflections stretch and contort. For an instant, I see Jess's reflection with tears streaming down her cheeks, even though her face in reality is dry. I see myself grinning in the glass, but I'm not smiling at all. A trick of the light, I tell myself, my heart pounding. Then the clowns are just there. No rustle of fabric, no footsteps, nothing. One moment, the pathway is empty. The next, they lean against the canvas walls, stiff as corpses propped up for a grim display. Some wear shredded costumes that smell of old sweat and mildew. Their paint flakes away, revealing skin beneath that's uneven and pallid, as if molded from curdled milk. Others stand at impossible angles, their eyes never blinking, their lips twisted into cracked smiles. I feel my breath hitch. A quiet, involuntary laugh escapes me, a tiny sound like air escaping a punctured balloon. Immediately, one clown's head jerks toward me. His eyes gleam, and I swear I see his grin grow wider. My laughter, he wants it. He's hungry for it. Jess's voice trembles. "We're tougher than this," she says, but her whisper gives her away. I see her fingers curling into her palm, nails leaving half-moon imprints. At the corridor's end stands the final clown. His costume might have been yellow once, but now it's a patchwork of stains. Duct tape holds it together, and his gloves droop at the fingertips. His painted face has bubbled, as if scorched, revealing cracked flesh beneath. His grin seems carved into his skin, stretching so wide the corners of his mouth bleed. When I nervously chuckle again, my defense mechanism firing without permission, he twitches. His body barely moves, yet I feel him lunge toward that sound. Jess inhales sharply, and I grab her arm. We stumble out into the night air, lungs heaving. Behind us, the Calliope's tune sputters, and I think I hear a soft giggle trailing after us. At home, my dad barely looks up from the TV when I tell him something's off. "Just kids playing pranks," he says, dismissing me. He won't even lock the windows I ask him to. I laugh bitterly under my breath, a scared, hollow sound. It doesn't help. That night, a tapping wakes me, soft, measured taps at my window. Tap, tap, tap. My heart stutters. I don't want to look, but I have to. He's there, under the street lamp, the clown, holding a limp red balloon. His eyes reflect the weak light, and I see his grin in profile. I blink, and he's gone. But the next morning, that same red balloon is tied to my porch railing, smeared with greasy fingerprints, in shaky red letters. Laugh. At school, Jess avoids the crowded hallways and waits for me behind the gym. Her face is pale. She shows me her phone, a text with no words, just a blank message that arrived at 3 a.m. "I heard giggling outside my window," she whispers, her voice cracking. "I tried calling you, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud." She forces a laugh, and it's worse than if she'd cried. I realize she's trying to stay strong for both of us, but it's costing her something dear. That evening, I try calling Jess, no answer. I send a text. "You okay?" Nothing. Hours pass. I pace my room, every creak of the house stabbing my nerves. My breathing is shallow, my mouth dry. I fight the urge to laugh. Every time I feel it rising, I clamp my lips shut. I think of that clown's eyes snapping toward my laughter like a predator scenting blood. Around midnight, I hear the faintest strains of Calliope music drifting through the open crack of my window. It's impossible. There's no carnival ride near my house. But it's there, waltzing through the darkness. I slam the window shut, my hands shaking. In the morning, I find something worse. Tied around my closet door handle is a thin red balloon string. No balloon, just the string, frayed at the end. I know he was inside. I taste blood where I've bitten my lip. Jess doesn't show up at school. Her locker remains closed, textbooks untouched. By noon, rumors swirl. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she's sick. I know better. She wouldn't abandon me like this. I decide to go back to the carnival grounds. Most of the rides are packing up, trucks rumbling away, leaving churned mud and scraps of paper. But the Laughing Mile tent still sags at the edge, as if waiting for me. Inside, the stench hits immediately, coppery and sour, like rancid syrup poured over old pennies. My eyes water. The clowns are gone. In their place, costumes hang limp on wooden stands, paint-peeling masks nailed to the canvas. At the far end, where the yellow-clad clown stood, I find a wall covered in photographs. Dozens of faces from our town stare back at me. Some I recognize. A neighbor, a kid from math class, the school librarian. Each appears in multiple photos, looking more hollow in each successive shot, smiles more strained, eyes more distant. It's as if he's draining them piece by piece. My breath catches when I see Jess's face pinned at the center. In the first photo, she's faking a brave smile, eyes wide. In the next, her grin is twisted, as if forced. In the final photo, her eyes are half-lidded, her face slack and empty, a balloon string draped over her shoulder like a noose. Below her pictures and mine, scrawled in trembling handwriting. "You're perfect." I stagger back, bile rising in my throat. He chose us. He knew Jess's secret fear and my nervous laughter. That's what he's after. Laughter tainted by terror, fear masquerading as mirth. It's not just any laughter he wants. He wants the laughter that tries to hide horror, the kind I've been relying on all my life. He feeds on it, savoring each forced giggle as if it's a delicacy. I run from the tent, stumbling, heart pounding. The calliope music drifts on the wind, mocking me. I know he's marked me. I can feel it in every panicked breath. That night, I try to stay awake. I wedge a chair under the doorknob, clutch a dull kitchen knife in my sweating hand. My father's locked in his room, uninterested. He thinks I'm being dramatic. I'm alone. Sometime after midnight, I hear a wet, rasping breath. My skin prickles. I shine my flashlight around the room, and my beam lands on him, the clown, standing in the corner as if he's always been there. His costume sags, paint bubbling on his face. His grin is too wide, revealing teeth of varying lengths, black gums oozing something oily. He doesn't move right. His body seems to warp at the edges, as though reality can't contain him. In the mirror on my closet door, I see his reflection behind me, even though he stands in front of me. The physics don't match. My throat constricts. I try to scream, but only a choked laugh comes out, thin and desperate. His eyes gleam. He steps forward silently, his gloved hand clamping around my wrist. The glove is damp, smelling like old graves and sour milk. Something sharp presses through the fabric, pricking my skin. He leans close, his breath hot and rotten. "Laugh for me," he whispers, voice scraping like a broken calliope pipe. I thrash, kicking out blindly. He's heavier than he looks, pressing me into the mattress. He tries to pry my lips open, to shape my mouth into a grin. I feel his nails, or are they teeth, against my cheek. My flashlight's beam wavers, catching his face at an angle that makes my stomach turn. His shadow doesn't match his movements. It reaches for me independently, thin arms stretching. Footsteps thunder in the hallway. My parents. The door rattles. The clown hisses, a high rattling sound. In that instant, I manage to twist the knife's hilt into his side. He jerks back, grin faltering. The door bursts open, and light floods in. My parents stand there, confused, seeing only their trembling child in a tangle of sheets. The clown is gone, vanished like he was never there, but he leaves a calling card, a single balloon tied to my bedpost, and a Polaroid on the pillow. It shows Jess mid-scream, or maybe mid-laugh, I can't tell. Her face is contorted, eyes glassy, her fear and mirth indistinguishable. I drop the photo, hands shaking. My father shakes his head, muttering something about nightmares. He won't meet my eyes. The police find nothing. The carnival has moved on, leaving only trampled grass and a hollow ache in my chest. Days pass. I can't sleep. The laughter of the town sounds different now, harsher, as if everyone's forcing it. Jess is gone, her locker a silent memorial. I can't eat. Every bite tastes like rot. I catch myself laughing at strange moments, a creak in the hallway, a gust of wind rattling the window pane. The laughter spills out involuntarily, jagged and empty. It's not mine anymore. It belongs to him. I've realized something. He doesn't need to stand outside my window. He's inside me now. He's taken that nervous laugh I used as a shield and turned it into a wound that won't close. Every giggle that escapes my lips feels like a scream trapped in reverse. I see him in the corner of my vision sometimes, just a blur of yellow-brown cloth and a too-wide grin reflected in a darkened TV screen. When I spin around, nothing's there, but I know he's waiting. This was never about killing me quickly. It's about savoring my fear, drawing out my laughter until it's raw and bleeding. And when I'm too exhausted to fight, when I've laughed myself hoarse, he'll come again. And this time, I won't have the strength to resist. In the quiet darkness of my room, I hear the echo of distant calliope music, faint as a dying breath. I force my eyes shut, but his grin burns behind my eyelids. I press my hands to my mouth, trying to stifle the laughter bubbling up. It slips out anyway, a cracked giggle that tastes of rust and regret. I picture him standing just behind me, stretching his skeletal fingers toward the corners of my mouth, ready to shape my final grin. The idea makes me tremble. He chose me because my laughter was already broken, and now it's his forever. I laugh again, soft and helpless. I know he'll return. I'm perfect for him after all. The first time I saw him, he stood at the edge of my cornfield beneath an October moon. A scythe glinted in his hand, its blade reflecting cold bluish light like a piece of sharpened ice. The air pressed down on me, heavy, expectant, while the wind hesitated, as if the land itself refused to breathe. My flashlight caught him too easily, as though he'd been waiting in that exact spot. White face paint flaked around hollow eyes, and his grin was a ragged slash of red. He wore a faded boiler suit, the sort a mechanic or a hired farmhand might wear, and across his chest was a stitched name patch. Lewis. I knew that name, but couldn't place it fully. Something from the family's past, unfinished, unresolved. He stood absolutely still, scythe lowered but never harmless. At his feet lay an old work glove, frayed at the cuff, the kind my grandfather's laborers once wore. I opened my mouth to demand who he was, but before sound formed, he stepped backward. The corn rustled too late, as if startled by his vanishing. I hurried forward, flashlight trembling, finding only stalks and silence. He moved with impossible quiet, like a memory slipping out of reach. That night, I barely slept. Behind my eyelids lurked his cracked face, his silent departure, and that name, Lewis, dangling in the back of my mind. The next evening, I patrolled the rows with my truck's spotlight, knuckles white on the wheel. After an hour, I caught him deeper in the fields. He raised his scythe slowly, deliberately, and whistled a thin, off-key tune that snagged in the silence like a rusted nail. I saw something new this time. He carried a scrap of metal, part of a tractor's linkage maybe, tucked into his belt. My stomach clenched. Did it belong to Lewis's old machine, the one my grandfather never talked about? "Hey!" I shouted, rage sparking from fear. "What do you want?" No reply. He stepped backward again, corn leaves rattling in protest. He waited just a second longer than before, forcing me to confront him with my eyes, to acknowledge he was here. My pulse hammered. Then he vanished, leaving only that whispered whistle fading behind him. Inside, I seethed. This trespasser dragged old names and old debts into my present. I felt trapped between confusion, fear, and a fierce anger at my grandfather. Why had we never spoken of this Lewis in detail? What unpaid dues lingered in our soil? On the third night, I came armed with my grandfather's shotgun. The moonlight iced the land. Near the barn, I spotted him again, closer than I dared imagine. He snapped a Polaroid of the barn door latch. Click, whir, the print emerging with a soft mechanical sigh. Then he placed something beneath the latch, a torn ledger page. Its faded ink listed debts never settled, wages never paid. I recognized the looping scrawl of my grandfather's handwriting. Lewis's name recurred, his share never marked as fulfilled. My chest tightened with a new understanding. The clown wasn't just a random terror. He carried the weight of a wronged man's ghost, an echo of injustice haunting us through objects and memory. Was he guilt made flesh or something older, justice prowling in grease paint? He stepped back, again so calmly, making me recoil. My shotgun shook in my grip. That off-key whistle drifted into the darkness, and once more, he was gone. I found a note wedged under the ledger scrap, my grandfather's confession, scrawled in shaky pencil. Lewis deserved his share after harvest. God forgive me. A hollow ache formed in my gut. We had built prosperity here, yet it sat atop unpaid debts and broken promises. I had inherited land and guilt together, and now the land demanded an accounting. At dawn, I searched the attic for clues. Dust and shadows whispered of old secrets. I found a newspaper clipping. Farmhand dies in tragic accident. In the margin, a scribble. I should have helped him. I imagined my grandfather's regrets souring over the decades. I was furious he'd left this rot hidden. Furious I bore the brunt of a sin I never knew. And beneath the fury, a creeping guilt that I'd profited from silence, taken the harvest without asking whose hands had sown it. By dusk, fresh signs of intrusion appeared, a muddy footprint in my kitchen. He'd been inside. Nowhere was safe. This clown, this embodiment of something owed, was guiding me down a path toward the orchard, the place that anchored our family's history. On the fourth night, I followed a quiet scraping sound, metal on wood, into the orchard. It felt ancient and sickly alive. Gnarled trunks twisted into arthritic shapes, their branches clutching at the sky. The air smelled wrong, sweet rot mixed with damp earth, as if the orchard itself exhaled secrets. The wind died, leaving only a hush heavy enough to crush the breath from my lungs. I heard distant groans from old branches, or perhaps from something else entirely. I found him standing over a small weathered marker, half buried in moss. Lewis's grave, or something like it. He tapped the scythe blade against the marker, 1, 2, 3 times, each strike a hollow metronome of condemnation. The orchard grew oppressive, leaves rustling in rhythmic whispers as though straining to speak. I raised the shotgun, arms stiff. He came closer, an unsettling approach just enough to brush the edge of my jacket. I felt the cold scrape of metal near my ribs, the reek of grease paint and damp earth. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. He reached out, fingertips skimming the gun's barrel, then slowly moved his hand away, as if dismissing violence altogether. He wanted something else, something I owed. He extended another Polaroid. I took it with trembling hands. It showed my fields at night, the orchard trees looming in the background. And in the reflective window pane of my house stood a faint, distorted face that resembled my grandfather. The effect was grotesque, features twisted by moonlight, mouth warped into a silent plea. This was my inheritance, a legacy of wrongdoing immortalized in cheap film, my throat constricted. "I never did this," I said, voice shaking. "I never cheated Lewis. I didn't know." But I tasted the lie's bitterness. I had never asked, never questioned. I'd taken my place here and reaped the land's gifts. That complicity, that silence tied me to my grandfather's sin. He tapped the scythe again, 1, 2, 3, like a judge's gavel in the quiet night. My anger drained, leaving only shame. "I'm not innocent," I admitted, tears burning, "but I'll try to set it right." The words scraped my throat. I felt the orchard closing in, the air thick with old accusations. Did my remorse matter now? Could reparation ease decades of betrayal? He cocked his head, listening, evaluating. Then, as if satisfied or resigned, he stepped backward behind the marker. In an instant, he was gone. I stumbled forward, nearly tripping over a root, but found only emptiness. No footsteps, no scythe. Just the orchard's silence and a lingering odor like rust and mildew. The orchard's darkness pressed close, as if holding the memory of every unspoken debt. After that night, I tried to make amends. I searched for descendants of Lewis, made quiet donations to those who worked the fields, and spoke openly of what I'd learned. Townsfolk looked at me strangely. Some dismissed me as rattled by nightmares. Others whispered that I'd seen something unholy. Still, I persisted, scattering seeds of restitution in shallow soil, hoping something honest would take root. He never returned in person, but his presence lingered. A week later, I found a Polaroid tucked under my front step, the orchard at dusk, a tractor's rusted wheel half buried in the earth. The scythe-shaped corn husk he left on my porch twisted in the wind. The land would not forget. Neither would I. Tonight I listen through the window. The corn hisses, its susurration full of half-formed words. The moonlight slicks the fields to pale blades of light. I feel the weight of my rifle leaning in the corner behind me. Outside, a sudden gust of wind rattles old branches against the siding. It almost sounds like that scraping scythe. A new tension grips me. The clown, whatever he was, forced me to see the truth. The land itself harbors old debts. It remembers and it demands we acknowledge what we've sown. I press my forehead against the glass, half expecting to glimpse that cracked grin in the reflection. I see nothing, but the orchard creaks as if laughing, and the wind swells with whispers that curl through the corn. I catch a sour note of that off-key whistle drifting faintly between the rows before it cuts off. My heart tightens. There is no escaping the reckoning. The soil is rich with secrets, and every seed sprouts shadows beneath the moonlight. I remain here, watchful and burdened, breathing unevenly into the silence. The rifle stays loaded. The wind picks up, and the corn rustles louder, as if naming me, accusing me, reminding me that some debts can never be fully paid. I remember cresting the hill into Harrow's Edge with my heart wedged in my throat, the ache familiar yet sharper this time. Before I left years ago, I'd always considered this place a dull backdrop, brittle sidewalks, sagging porches, and merchants who barely glanced up as you passed. Now even the sunlight seemed to avoid the paint-flaked storefronts. The wind sighed through rooftops, bowed under their own weight. I'd told myself I was coming back only to handle estate paperwork, but my real purpose pressed on me like a bruise. I needed to learn what happened all those decades ago, what my grandfather's silence had purchased, and why guilt clung to our surname like wet leaves stuck in gutters. At my childhood home, the flash of red and blue police lights spun sluggish halos on the Morris porch. Inside, the kitchen had been rearranged into a makeshift stage, chairs shoved back against the walls, a single clown shoe placed in the center of the linoleum as if it were the star of some twisted one-act play. Confetti littered the floor in limp, glittering clusters. On the wallpaper, a furious red scrawl. I didn't need words to feel the accusation bleeding through. My stomach knotted. I remembered rumors whispered late at night. A grand carnival once dazzled Harrow's Edge, bringing laughter and color, until children went missing, money vanished, and a blaze ended it all. My family name had drifted through those rumors like ash on the wind. Now, decades later, this eerie spectacle hinted that old wounds were being torn open. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, recalling how my parents had once spoken in half-truths about the past, avoiding my questions, their voices brittle. Through the open window came a tinny, off-key carnival tune. I rushed to the sill and glimpsed a hooded figure slipping behind the fence, a portable speaker cutting off mid-note. Not ghosts, no supernatural force, just careful intruders teasing us with secrets long buried. A few days later, another break-in rattled the town's fragile calm. A family's living room transformed into a perverse tightrope act, a rope strung across the space, chairs aligned as if an audience waited. The parents were found gagged, carnival tickets stuffed in their mouths, their daughters' sobs etched into the dust. The tickets bore the same scrawled symbols I'd seen before. I recalled a story my father had let slip once. The tightrope walker who dared to accuse certain council members of skimming profits before disappearing forever. Now I saw the crime replayed, as though history demanded a second performance. Delaney called me soon after. We'd grown up side by side under these gray skies, but when I fled years ago, they stayed behind, tending my parents' old house and trying to preserve some piece of normalcy. Now their voice trembled over the line. They've been in my home. Please come. Delaney was always steady, the one who quietly tidied messes and shored up the walls of my fractured family life. Hearing them so shaken made my hands sweat. At Delaney's place, the smell of scorched rubber and sour sweat hit me first. Mirrors bore smeared clown faces, their painted smiles drooping. A balloon animal, charred at the edges, left a bitter tang in the air. Claw marks raked the wallpaper, and a frayed whip lay abandoned on the floor. Delaney's dog cowered beneath a table, eyes rolling. A note rested where silverware should have been, unreadable except for the sense of threat it radiated. Delaney's lips quivered as they spoke, voice hushed and uneven. They know exactly what hurts. My parents once took hush money from the carnival, their silence for someone else's screams. Your family paid even more. Blood money, maybe even matchsticks for the fire. Their eyes flicked to me, hollow and uncertain. You left town when things got complicated. Did you know what your grandfather had done? Are you part of this? Their words felt like needles beneath my skin. I had no good answer. I'd always sensed my family's unease but never pressed, happy to run from a place too full of half-spoken horrors. Stammering denials sounded weak, and Delaney turned away, shoulders shaking. Before I left, I found a note pinned behind the door in Delaney's own panicked handwriting. They whispered that the last act is near. I don't think I'll survive it. A few nights later, frantic pounding on my door wrenched me from fitful sleep. Delaney stumbled in, bruised, eyes wild. They tied me up, they said, voice cracking. Forced me to stand on a chair like a tightrope walker. Didn't speak, just stared. They burned a ticket stub into my wall with your name on it. Delaney pressed a small locket into my hand. This belonged to my mother, they whispered, voice trembling. If I vanish, remember me. We never asked for this. Then they slipped into the dark. By morning, Delaney was gone. No note, no body, just emptiness, and that locket's metal biting into my palm. Inside the locket, a scrap of paper scrawled in terror. They said I'd be the next act. The beast was only the beginning. I spent the day combing through old town records in the library's dusty back room, cornering elders who refused to lift their eyes. Gradually, the truth surfaced like a corpse in stagnant water. When the carnival owners threatened to expose the town's embezzlement and the vanishings of local children, leaders, including my grandfather, acted first. They locked the performers in their tents and struck a match. Flames consumed canvas and flesh. The survivors' screams were smothered beneath hush money and forged documents. Harrow's edge pretended innocence. But survivors must have scattered, bearing the scars and passing them down. Now their descendants had returned, human and furious, rehearsing a revenge as carefully choreographed as any circus routine. I realized they weren't guided by spirits or mysticism. Their methodology was painfully human. Portable speakers to mimic carnival tunes, cheap masks to hide their faces, paint and knives instead of illusions. Each act replicated an old sin, making us bear witness. They knew our names, our fears, our hiding places. I found old letters in my grandfather's files, threats he ignored, pleas for justice he never answered. They'd studied these documents the way a ringmaster studies routines. On the final night, I found my home rearranged into a macabre gallery. Heavy furniture angled at odd degrees, family photos replaced by yellowed newspaper clippings of the carnival fire. A small speaker rasped broken carnival music. I followed muffled footsteps into the basement, gripping a crowbar with shaking hands. A single bulb flickered, revealing dusty carnival programs tacked to the walls, my surname circled in red. Accusations, arrows, a family tree of guilt. A figure stood in the center, a man wearing a cheap plastic clown mask. His shoulders sagged under invisible weight. When he spoke, his voice was low, each word shaped by decades of pain. Your grandfather struck the match. His voice caught. I was a child, trapped inside the tent. I remember screams and wood poppin' in the heat. The stench of burning flesh followed me into every year of my life. We grew up twisted by that night, passing our grief down like an heirloom. Now we've taught you what it feels like to carry it, too. He stepped closer, sweat glistening on his jaw. We had children, and we never held them without tasting smoke. Every laugh was stained by old ashes. We became what we hated, using terror and silence like your town did, forcing you to look at truths you buried. He pressed a ticket stub into my hand. My name beneath the word performer. His voice dropped to a whisper. We don't need to kill you. You carry your family's guilt. Now carry our story. Live with it, as we have. A hollow ache pulsed in my chest. I saw now. They'd made me complicit by forcing me to witness, to understand. Delaney's suffering, the terrorized families, these staged acts, they were lessons. I hated my family for what they'd done. I hated the carnival descendants for turning pain into cruelty. Yet I understood them. Their innocence burnt away, their humanity warped. They believed they had no choice. At dawn, I staggered outside. Harrow's Edge looked unchanged, every shutter closed, pretending ignorance. The clowns had vanished into quiet streets. Delaney was gone, the locket's cool metal my only keepsake. I clenched the ticket stub branded performer, its edges cutting my palm. The word condemned me to remember, to bear witness. I knew that this town's silence had summoned these acts, and I suspected that if I tried to speak the truth, I'd only find more closed doors and averted eyes. I stood by the window, heart thudding. The carnival music had faded, but the memory still scraped at my ears. I could flee, but the guilt would stick to me like tar. I could shout the truth, but these people would never listen. What if I became a voice that refused to be hushed? The idea hovered, fragile as a balloon animal about to pop. Perhaps I could break the cycle by dragging the secrets into open air. Or perhaps that would only draw the clowns back, fueling their endless encore. In that uncertainty, I felt the burden settle. I pressed my forehead to the glass. The show isn't over, I whispered. It never was. If I stayed silent, the cycle would continue. If I spoke up, the town might deny it, and the clowns would return, feeding on that denial. Either choice kept the loop spinning, but doing nothing guaranteed its permanence. I stood there as morning light filtered weakly through the grime. My trembling fingers closed around the locket, Delaney's last plea echoing in my mind. We never asked for this. Neither had I. But now I would decide if I'd become a silent accomplice or a desperate truth-teller. Even in silence, I heard echoes of screams, smelled the burning canvas. I understood now that the performance would go on, unless someone refused to avert their gaze. I stepped forward, teeth clenched, holding the ticket stub and locket tight. This time, I wouldn't run. The town had played dumb for generations, and look where that had led us. I would speak, even if it brought them back. I would pull the curtain aside and show every charred program, every burnt match. If I failed, at least I'd go down fighting the silence that bred monsters. They would return. Yes. But this time, I would not play the passive role assigned to me. The cycle might still grind on, but I'd stand against it, struggling to break the ring of complicit hush. In that painful resolve, I found the barest spark of defiance. The show wasn't over, but neither were my attempts to stop it. The difference would be that now I'd face the truth head-on, locket and stub in hand, memory and guilt forging a weapon of words instead of silence. Only then, perhaps, could the curtains finally fall. We found site number 11 at dusk, after half an hour of bone-rattling bumps along a dirt road that looked abandoned for decades. In the sedan's headlights, a small clearing emerged amid towering pines whose branches clawed at the violet sky. Everything felt suffocatingly still, as though the forest were holding its breath. As I stepped out, tension curled in my stomach. Last summer's failure played on a loop in my mind. I'd hesitated during a crisis, and someone paid the price. I'd vowed never to freeze again, especially not when it came to protecting Tammy. Kelly ventured into the clearing first. She'd always been our compass, practical, unflappable. But tonight her gaze swept the perimeter for exits. Her jaw was set, her shoulders stiff. Brian followed, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. He'd pushed for this authentic adventure, but I saw regret in his forced grin. Tammy lingered by the car, white-knuckled on her backpack strap. She'd kept us united for years, stepping in when arguments flared. Now she gave me a questioning look, as if asking if I still believed in this place. Beneath her quiet calm, I sensed a fierce loyalty. She would protect us if it came down to it, and that knowledge tightened the knot of responsibility in my chest. As we unpacked, I felt something soft underfoot, a half-deflated balloon smeared with something dark. Kelly flinched, tossing it aside. Brian's strained laughter died. Tammy let out a worried hum. The forest smelled faintly sour, as if its rot was seeping into our lungs. We tried to focus on chores, pitching tents, gathering wood. I told myself we'd laugh off these jitters tomorrow. Still, my pulse throbbed with an unshakable unease. Later, we huddled around a meager campfire. Kelly organized supplies with robotic efficiency, once wiping away a tear when she thought no one saw. Brian recounted a bar fight he supposedly won, voice too loud, too bright. Tammy stayed close, nudging me gently, trying to anchor us. I tried to seem calm, determined. I wouldn't fail again. A rustle in the undergrowth cut through our fragile composure. All talk ceased. We saw it. A clown stepping into the firelight. Its costume hung in ragged strips, face paint cracked into a crooked grin. The way it tilted its head too far, then snapped it back, tested the limits of bone and sanity. Its oversized shoes squeaked as it stepped forward, then halted, observing us in silence. I felt a surge of adrenaline, remembering my past cowardice. Not this time. "Hey, who the hell are you?" Brian's voice quivered. The clown offered no reply, just a slow, mocking wave, and then retreated into the darkness. The silence that followed pressed on our skulls. Tammy's hand found mine. "We should leave," she whispered, voice trembling. Kelly nodded, unsure. Brian tried to shrug it off, but his voice cracked. Fear and exhaustion won. We locked the car and promised ourselves morning would bring clarity. None of us really believed it. Dawn shattered our delusion with a scream. Tammy's. We emerged to find her belongings scattered, one shoe gone. A balloon tied to her tent bore a single word in jagged scrawl. Smile. A rusted kitchen knife jutted from the soil. Small footprints led back into the woods. Tammy's voice shook. "This isn't a prank. It's dangerous." Guilt flashed across Kelly's face. Brian's bravado sagged. Tammy steadied us with quiet insistence. "We have to stay together." Her gaze flicked to me, as if reminding me of my promise. I clenched my fists. I wouldn't fail her. We decided to hike, looking for a signal or a clearer path out. The forest thickened, each step a nervous flinch. The clown left signs. Half-deflated balloons snagged on branches, tiny stone figurines arranged like crude humans. Brian's hand shook so badly he couldn't light another cigarette. Kelly barked at him for complaining about the rough trail, then apologized in tears. We were unraveling, our normal roles falling apart. An abandoned campsite greeted us. Torn tents, a charred fire ring, a balloon sagging overhead, carved into a log. "You won't leave." Tammy brushed the letters with trembling fingertips. We weren't the first. Brian's forced toughness collapsed. Kelly clutched my arm. "We have to go back. We have to try the car." There was a desperate logic in returning to the one familiar object we had. The walk back stretched painfully. Shadows lengthened. The light felt brittle and thin. At camp, we pretended normalcy. Kelly tried to start a fire, hands shaking. Tammy urged us to eat. Brian picked at his food silently. I scanned the perimeter, heart hammering. Every attempt at normalcy rang hollow. Night wrapped around us like a predator's jaws. We set a watch rotation. Kelly fed the fire. Brian paced and cursed under his breath. Tammy hovered close. "It's toying with us," she whispered, "studying us." Her eyes found mine. I'm ready to do what it takes. Fear and admiration warred inside me. I should have been the one offering strength, yet here she was, braver than I ever felt. A balloon popped in the darkness. Another drifted into view. Run. Opposite it, another. Stay. Confusion and dread tangled together. Suddenly, stones and sticks rained against our tents. Kelly snapped, charging into the woods with a makeshift club, screaming for the clown to show itself. She returned empty-handed, voice cracking. Then laughter echoed, a warped chorus of our own voices twisted into a mocking lullaby. It mimicked Brian's strained jokes, Kelly's harsh orders, Tammy's soothing tone. It replayed my silence, my blood iced. The clown wasn't just scaring us, it was dissecting our fears, our failures, savoring how we unraveled. We found another balloon at the fire's edge. "You're next." Brian's mask of bravado slipped away completely as he whispered, "This is my fault." No one corrected him. We all felt complicit in staying. Morning came, exposing new horrors. Our gear was shredded. A greasy smell clung to everything. Tammy's sleeping bag dangled from a branch like a sick trophy. Inside the car, a red balloon was tied to the steering wheel. Tammy's missing shoe dangling beneath it. Brian's phone was gone. Kelly's hands clenched and unclenched. I tasted blood. I'd bitten my lip in the night. The clown knew how to keep us off balance, how to strip away our security piece by piece. Desperate, we piled into the car. The engine roared, granting a flicker of hope. We sped along the rutted road until we glimpsed the clown on a distant ridge. It raised a hand, releasing a balloon skyward, as if marking our escape attempt. Tammy locked eyes with me. In her determined stare, I saw a warning. If cornered, she would do whatever it took to protect us. The engine sputtered and died. Kelly slammed the dashboard, tears rolling down her cheeks. Brian's eyes darted like a trapped animal's. The clown emerged onto the road, brandishing a knife. On either side of the path, balloons bobbed in a silent, mocking audience. I swallowed hard. My resolve wavered. We bolted into the trees. The clown followed, each exaggerated step squeaking, each breath a wheeze of excitement. Tammy stumbled, and I actually lunged forward, ready to help. But fear's grip slowed me. She was up before I reached her, pushing me onward. But the clown was gaining. Brian tripped. Kelly dragged him up, screaming at us to keep going. Then Tammy's voice, trembling. "I'll draw it away." She'd been telegraphing this all along, her quiet strength, her willingness to protect us. "No," I managed, finally forcing my feet to move toward her, to stop her. But she was already dashing left, shouting, "You want me, right?" Tears glistened on her cheeks, but her resolve held. My moment had come to act, to save her. Yet as I hurled myself forward, fear and old guilt slammed into me. My muscles locked for a heartbeat. Just a second. But that second was enough. The clown lunged at Tammy with a sickening speed. Her scream shattered the darkness. I stumbled forward too late, my arms swinging at empty air. Kelly yanked me back, sobbing, "We can't help her now." Brian moaned, "This is my fault," but I knew the blame was mine too. I had frozen again, even when Tammy needed me most. We ran until we found a road. A truck approached, slowed, then sped away. In its windshield's reflection, I thought I saw a clown's mask, or maybe just my own despair twisting reality. Laughter chased us, real, imagined, both. Tammy was gone, sacrificed to buy us seconds of life. No one believed us. The police were polite but skeptical. Locals offered knowing shrugs as if such horrors were rumored but never proven. Without evidence, no bodies, no proof, we sounded hysterical. Kelly walked in a haunted daze. Brian's apologies fell into silence. I paced my apartment, checking locks again and again. Every creak set my heart racing. Tammy's final look, trusting me, haunted every sleepless night. At home, paranoia wrapped around me. A neighbor mentioned a clown in the alley. I found nothing. A package arrived. Inside, a deflated balloon. No note. My lungs constricted. Maybe I was losing my grip. One rainy evening, I returned home to find a single red balloon tied to my door. A faint whiff of grease paint hung in the air. The handle was ajar. I stepped back, every nerve ablaze. Inside, footsteps or maybe just the drip of rain. By the time I mustered courage, the apartment was empty, but I understood the message. The forest hadn't stayed behind. The horror had followed me home, feeding on my guilt, my hesitation, my failure. Tammy's scream echoed in my mind. I had vowed never to freeze again, and yet I had. Now the clown's presence lingered at the edges of my vision, always watching, always waiting. I knew, with a certainty that hollowed me out, that the terror would never truly end. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who shares their nightmares online. But life has a way of pushing you into corners you never knew existed. About a year ago, I bought my first home, a modest Cape Cod-style place in a quiet, middle-class suburb. After a decade in a cramped city apartment where sirens screamed through thin walls, I craved silence. I'm in my mid-30s, work remotely in tech support, and I'm engaged to a project manager who travels 2 or 3 weeks each month. We'd adopted a rescue dog in the spring, a wiry little mutt named Jasper, who was timid but sweet. Everything here felt so stable. The kind of place where the only drama might be a neighbor's lawnmower starting too early on a Sunday morning. I even joked to friends that the biggest thrill in this sleepy cul-de-sac would be picking which hedge to trim first. The houses looked nearly identical. Modest yards, tidy fences, manicured shrubs. Late summer smelled like fresh grass and distant barbecues. The sidewalks were smooth and empty. Everyone waved hello. I thought I'd earned this quiet after so many years of chaos and noise. Before moving in, I installed a few basic security cameras, just cheap models pointed at the driveway, the front door, and the back patio. Nothing fancy. Mostly I wanted to keep an eye on packages or the occasional raccoon. I'd get those pinging alerts on my phone at random hours. 99% were harmless. A cat slinking by, a delivery truck's headlights, a possum waddling across the lawn. It was comforting, in a dull way. Proof I was in a safe place where nothing truly alarming happened. For the first few months, that assumption held. No weirdness, no drama. Until one morning, about 6 months after I moved in, my phone showed a 3 a.m. alert from the backyard. Normally, I'd roll over and ignore it, but something made me check this time. An odd tension in my gut, like a subtle warning bell ringing in an empty house. The footage was grainy and dark, lit only by my single dim security light. At the back edge of my lawn, half concealed behind my fence's corner post and a clutch of overgrown shrubs, stood a figure. They wore all dark clothing, loose enough that I couldn't make out a build, and a mask. At first I thought ski mask, but then I noticed something off. The face was stark white with red paint around the mouth and nose. A clown mask, not a garish circus style, but something unsettlingly minimalist. The eye holes were just large enough to reveal a shine of skin beneath. The painted grin stretched too wide, turning the face into a silent, mocking leer. The figure stayed perfectly still for several seconds, then tipped their head to one side, acknowledging the camera with a careful, deliberate motion. No wave, no word, just that slow, unnerving tilt. After a moment, they stepped backward, fading into darkness. I remember the light sheen of sweat on my palms, the subtle hum of my refrigerator in the silent kitchen as I watched this on my phone. Who the hell stands in someone's yard at 3 a.m. wearing a clown mask? I told myself it was probably a dumb prank. Maybe teenagers testing boundaries, someone passing through. I tried to forget it, but at night, I replayed that moment. The way they just observed, like I was an exhibit behind glass. A few nights later, another alert. This time, the clown stood closer, near the driveway, beneath the maple tree that my fiancé and I often parked under. Same posture, shoulders slightly slumped, head angled, as though studying my front windows. When I showed the clip to my fiancé over video call, she was in Denver for work. She frowned but tried to steady me. It's just kids messing around. Install a brighter light, maybe. Her face looked concerned but distant. She had a flight the next morning. She wasn't here to feel the uncanny hush of the neighborhood at 3 a.m. Soon after, my dog Jasper started waking me, growling low at the back door around 2 or 3 in the morning. I'd sometimes hear a soft tapping on the siding near my bedroom window, on the second floor. Impossible without a ladder. More than once I crept to the window only to find nothing. Reviewing camera footage later, I'd catch a glimpse of the clown slipping out of frame. In one clip, they held something small and metallic, a tiny bell or a ring of keys, and jangled it softly, as though calling an animal or taunting me with the knowledge they could hold something of mine without me knowing. I stopped sleeping well. I bought brighter motion sensor lights and a better deadbolt for the patio door. Every squeak of the floorboards made me flinch. When my fiancée came home for a few days and saw the hollow look in my eyes, she tried again to calm me. They're testing limits. They'll get bored, she said, running her hand over my arm, but her voice had lost its easy reassurance. She locked the doors twice, checked the windows herself. Still, she chalked it up to a prowler, a drifter. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was intentional, personal even. I asked around the neighborhood, careful not to sound unhinged. Mr. Lewis down the street mentioned his side gate was found open one morning. The couple next door said they heard footsteps on their gravel driveway one night, but never saw anyone. Rumors popped up on a local forum. Someone in a nearby suburb mentioned a clown prowler spotted on doorbell cameras. Always silent, never caught. Most dismissed it as bored teens or a TikTok stunt. I brought footage to the police station. The young officer behind the desk watched it, nodded slowly. Creepy, he said. "But unless they're breaking in or committing a crime, we can't do much." He offered advice about better locks and a recommendation for a reputable security company. He looked tired. Understaffed department, maybe. I left feeling foolish and exposed. Then the clown escalated. They started appearing almost every other night, always between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. I'd see them at the fence line, then at the patio door, pressing that horrible white and red grin close to the glass. They never tried to force entry while I watched, just stared into my living room. Another night, I saw them near my trash bins, sifting through discarded mail. They began leaving things for me. My spare mailbox key, missing for weeks, placed neatly on the porch. A gardening glove of mine, folded at the doorstep. A childhood photo I'd stored in a sealed box in the garage, now slipped under the doormat. Each item came from my property. The clown wasn't just lurking. They were rummaging through my life, learning about me in the quiet dark. I became jumpy. I triple-checked every lock before bed. I added window bars to the downstairs windows and upgraded my cameras. My fiancée, home again briefly, blanched at the new footage. The clown testing the patio door handle, tilting the camera on the back wall so it would capture only the top of their head, as if toying with the frame. She believed me now. How could she not? Her face was drawn, eyes darting to every dark corner of the yard when we let Jasper out. We argued about hiring private security or just leaving. But where would we go? And why should we be driven out of our home? One night, I decided I couldn't be passive anymore. I turned off all the lights to appear asleep and waited in the living room with a heavy flashlight gripped in my sweaty palm. I kept my phone on the table, ready to dial 911. At about 3:10 a.m., a slight rustle outside the front window set my nerves alight. I parted the curtain by an inch. The clown stood inches from the glass, close enough that I could see the uneven brushstrokes of red paint on the mask. I caught a whiff of damp earth and stale leaves through the cracked window. Hands trembling, I dialed the police and whispered my address. As I did, the clown raised a gloved finger to their painted lips, the grin unwavering. "Shh," it said silently, as if they knew I was calling for help. My pulse hammered. I wondered if they could hear it. Within minutes, a patrol car's headlights sliced across my lawn. By the time the officers stepped out, the yard was empty. They found no footprints, no dropped items, nothing. "Could be a prankster who bolted when we arrived," one officer said, looking unconvinced. They promised to keep an eye on my street, but I could tell they thought I was another paranoid homeowner rattled by the news cycle. After that, the clown's behavior changed. They were more impatient. On camera, I caught them pacing along the fence, tapping gently on the wood siding. I noticed my motion sensor lights wouldn't trigger some nights. Later, I found the bulbs unscrewed just enough to remain dark. They rearranged my garden tools, leaving them in odd patterns, small shifts, subtle enough that I doubted my memory. Dead leaves arranged in a tidy line by the doorstep. A wind chime I never owned hooked onto the gutter, tinkling softly at dawn. Their presence was everywhere and nowhere, carving a steady groove of dread into my mind. My fiancée finally decided we needed a real plan. So we left, quietly. We booked a hotel room out by the highway, told no one but the police. We set lights on timers, closed the blinds, made it look like we were still home. From the hotel, I watched my camera feeds on a laptop. Around 2:30 a.m., the clown appeared, more frantic now, trying the back door again and again. They rattled the handles of the garden shed and tapped at the windows. They stepped back to face the camera and held up a handwritten note, the letters spidery and slanted. "Where did you go?" My stomach clenched. They knew we were gone. I forwarded the footage to the police dispatcher immediately. Finally, concrete evidence of attempted break-in. The police promised increased patrols and advised us to return during the day. Maybe a show of activity and some real security upgrades could deter this freak. Back home the following evening, we installed top-of-the-line locks, reinforced window frames, invested in a professional alarm system, and angled more cameras at every approach to the house. I moved my desk away from the windows, kept my phone always within reach. That night, I got another motion alert. The clown stood at the back fence, fingers trailing along the slats as if testing their strength. I called the police at once. This time, the cruiser arrived swiftly, their flashlights sweeping over grass and shrub. By the time the beams touched the spot where the clown had stood, only a scrap of bright fabric, a piece of their costume maybe, remained snagged on a splinter of wood. No figure, no footprints, no trace beyond that torn scrap of color. It was as though the earth had swallowed them whole. After that night, the clown never returned. Days stretched into weeks. The police drove by more often. I allowed myself one afternoon to breathe a little easier. Yet I did not feel safe. How could I? I kept the curtains drawn, even on sunny mornings, and slept with a baseball bat beside the bed. My fiancée tried to reassure me, but the damage was done. This house, once a sanctuary of quiet suburbia, felt tainted. I caught myself glancing at corners where a camera might not reach. What if they were there, just out of frame, smiling behind that painted mask? We've talked about selling, about leaving this place behind. But a new house won't erase the memory of a gloved finger pressed to painted lips. I never learned who they were or what they wanted. Were they satisfied with the fear they'd sown? Were they waiting for a perfect opportunity that never came? The uncertainty gnaws at me. Sometimes late at night I still check the feeds, scrolling through the shadows in the yard for any flicker of movement. Edit. Thank you for reading. Putting this down feels wrong, like inviting the memory back in. But I need someone else to know. I still live here, pretending things are normal, but I check the cameras every single night before I try to sleep. Because if that clown ever comes back, I need to see it coming. I'm not entirely sure what finally pushed me to write this down. Maybe it was my daughter's question last week, when she asked out of the blue why I never let her play alone at the old playground anymore. Or maybe it was the local news piece on stranger safety that brought those memories rushing back. It's been years since that summer, but the images remain painfully vivid. I still recall the cracked face paint, the deliberate wave. I'm hoping that by telling this, I might warn someone, anyone, to stay vigilant. Because not every danger announces itself with a bang. Sometimes it just stands there on the sidewalk, waiting for you to look away. Back in late summer 2019, we were living in Benton Grove, a small Midwestern town where it felt like everyone knew your name. We were the kind of place that still held a yearly peach festival on Main Street, where neighbors swapped stories over backyard fences and kids rode their bikes to the park after dinner. The community playground, nestled behind the old red brick elementary school, was our centerpiece. Parents gathered on worn benches, chatting and laughing as children climbed the jungle gym and swung high under fading orange skies. It was a place of comfort and routine. I never thought twice about letting my daughter join her friends there until the streetlights came on. The first time I heard the rumor, it was at my daughter's 8th birthday party. A fellow mom leaned in, voice low and trembling, to tell me someone had spotted a clown across from the playground. According to her, he stood by an old green mailbox, just watching. He didn't call out. He didn't try to cross over. He only waved, a slow, soundless greeting. At first I almost laughed. Who dresses up like a clown to lurk near kids in 2019? But the fear in her eyes was genuine. Another parent overheard and nodded, confirming the sighting. There was a tension in the room I couldn't shake. They believed it, and that made my skin crawl. About a week later, I saw him too. We'd wrapped up my daughter's soccer practice late in the afternoon. She was in the back seat, rummaging through her bag for a juice box, while I loaded some extra cones into the trunk. That's when I glimpsed a smear of yellow out of the corner of my eye. Across the street, half hidden behind a utility pole, stood a clown. His suit looked old, its once bright colors dulled by grime. The painted face had begun to crack, revealing pale skin beneath, and the grin on his lips never flickered. He slowly raised one hand and waved, like we were old friends. My heart went cold. I felt my mouth go dry, and I locked the car door almost instinctively. My daughter asked what was wrong. I told her nothing, and got us out of there as fast as I could. The next morning, I started asking other parents, trying to keep my voice steady. Some had called the police already. A patrol car apparently rolled through a few times, but the moment it arrived, the clown vanished. No footprints in the soft dirt near the curb. No tire marks suggesting where he might have parked a car. Just an empty sidewalk where he'd stood moments before. The kids thought it was an odd game. Spot the clown. But for us adults, it was a gnawing worry. A strange man dressed as a clown, lingering near our children, never approaching, never speaking. It felt like a threat waiting to unfurl. A week later, that threat became real. My neighbor's 7-year-old son came home shaken to his core. The poor boy was pale, damp with sweat, and he refused to let go of his mother's hand. Between gasping sobs, he described how the clown had spoken to him for the first time. The voice was muffled and low, as if forced through layers of fabric. "Come with me," the clown had said, gesturing toward the line of trees behind the playground. "I have something to show you." The boy bolted. He didn't stop until he reached his front porch, tears streaming down his face. When his mother shared this on the local Facebook parents group that evening, the reaction was swift. Neighbors called the police in a panic. Flyers started appearing on telephone poles warning parents to keep their children close. The school principal sent an email urging families to supervise their kids at all times. Benton Grove's easygoing warmth was replaced by a current of quiet terror. We speculated. Was he a drifter? Some twisted individual who got a thrill out of scaring parents? The patrol cars became more frequent, but they never caught a glimpse. Like a phantom, the clown would emerge and vanish on his own schedule. At some point, a handful of us decided we'd had enough. There were 4 of us, 2 dads, myself, and another mom. We agreed to search the woods where the clown had tried to lure that boy. One of the dads insisted on bringing a baseball bat. "Just in case," he muttered, eyes hard. Late one afternoon, with the sun still strong enough to cut through the leaves, we pushed into the undergrowth. It was painfully quiet. No birdsong, no distant laughter, just our footsteps crushing leaves and the sound of our breathing. About 10 minutes in, we found it. A small clearing hidden behind thick bushes. It looked like a makeshift campsite. There was a filthy sleeping bag, flattened soda cans, candy wrappers scattered around. The smell of mildew clung to everything. And then there were the clown items. Cheap plastic masks, each painted differently. One with matted red yarn hair, another with jagged black lines for a mouth. Greasy, stained overalls, folded and shoved into a plastic bag. But the worst part was pinned to a low-hanging branch, a series of charcoal sketches. They depicted the very playground we knew so well. In one, children played on the swings, while a clown-like figure hid behind a tree. In another, a child's arm was drawn tied to something, just rough charcoal lines, but enough to make my stomach turn. There was also something recognizable, a hair ribbon that belonged to a neighbor's daughter, tied into a knot on one of the clown masks. That girl had lost it a week ago at the playground. He'd been close enough to take it without anyone noticing. My hands were shaking as I snapped pictures with my phone. The other parents went pale. We left quickly, stepping backward, alert to any rustle. None of us spoke until we were safely out of the woods. Then we called the police. This time, they arrived promptly. 2 squad cars and an unmarked vehicle. They taped off the area, questioned us, examined every item. We waited, anxious, hoping this would be the end. But after hours of searching, they gave us nothing solid. No ID, no leads, just vague promises to increase patrols and keep investigating. Their frustration was obvious, but so was their inability to pin this down. The clown had left no trace of himself beyond these chilling artifacts. After that discovery, sightings dwindled. Maybe we'd rattled him. Maybe the police presence made it harder for him to show his face. By mid-September, he vanished altogether. No one saw the clown leaning against the mailbox again. No one spotted him at dusk by the jungle gym. The whispered theories continued. Some said he moved on to another unsuspecting town. Others believed he'd been caught for something else entirely. The police offered no closure. Eventually, the conversation died down, replaced by the usual hum of daily life. But the mark he left on us never truly faded. My daughter, who used to skip happily to the playground without a second thought, now gripped my hand whenever we passed the schoolyard. She asked me point blank why I was so tense, why I kept scanning the street corners. What was I supposed to say? That I was terrified we'd look up and see a flash of yellow and red, a wavering hand beckoning silently. We upgraded our home security. A few families arranged for rotating watch shifts at the park. Nobody said it out loud, but trust had been broken. We weren't the same place anymore. To this day, I'm haunted by glimpses. A balloon tied to a fence can make my heart skip. A man in a bright jacket across the store aisle can send a jolt of panic through my veins. I know it's not him. I know it's just my mind playing tricks. But the doubt lingers. Because we never caught him, never heard the end of the story. Without an arrest or a face unmasked, the fear never fully goes away. I'm telling this because we often think of monsters as ghosts or beasts of legend. But sometimes, they're just people. Ordinary men with twisted desires and cheap costumes, lurking on a quiet street. If you ever sense something is off, if you catch sight of a stranger who doesn't belong, who watches children a little too closely, don't shrug it off. Trust your instincts. Tell someone, make a call, because not everyone who smiles at your kids means them well. And if you ever see a clown across the street, silent and waving, don't pretend it's a joke. Act. Before you find yourself awake at night, wondering if he's out there somewhere, waiting for another chance to say hello. I still remember the night that Carnival rolled into town, even though it's been nearly 3 decades since. It was the summer before my junior year of high school, sometime in the mid-90s, and there wasn't much to do in our small town once darkness fell. So when a traveling carnival set itself up in that big vacant lot near the old highway exit, everyone flocked there. My friends and I were no exception. There were 5 of us that night. Mark, always the ringleader, ready for any cheap thrill. His girlfriend Lisa, more reserved and level-headed. Danny, who smoked too much and rarely spoke above a mumble. Janet, who had a thing for haunted houses and all that morbid stuff. And me. I was mostly just along for the ride, happy to escape the same old movie theater and the stale smell of the local bowling alley. The carnival had that unmistakable energy. A swirl of neon lights, laughter and screams blending with the tinny hum of carousel music. The air tasted like funnel cakes and cotton candy, the ground littered with popcorn kernels crushed under countless sneakers. The summer heat pressed down, making us sweat even after the sun had set. It was all oddly comforting and unsettling at once, exactly the kind of place you'd expect rowdy teenagers to gravitate toward. By the time we stumbled across the funhouse, we'd already wasted some money on rigged carnival games and taken a spin on a creaky Ferris wheel. The funhouse's entrance was marked by a makeshift sign, a faded clown face painted on warped plywood. It looked cheap, even by carnival standards, and the recorded laughter crackling through a nearby speaker sounded more sickly than playful. Still, Mark was all for it. "Come on," he said, tugging Lisa's hand. "This'll be good for a laugh." Janet agreed, grinning. Danny shrugged, following silently. I hesitated a bit, but curiosity got the best of me. We lined up behind a few other kids, watching how the workers guided people in. But there was something off about the clown, not the one painted on the sign, but a tall, lean figure standing just inside the entrance. I assumed he was part of the attraction. He wore a stained jumpsuit and a painted face, though the makeup looked hastily done, as if applied in poor light. The white grease paint didn't cover his cheeks evenly, and his red smile was shaky and irregular, more like a smear than a grin. He didn't juggle or dance like you might expect. Instead, he stood too still, then would lean forward suddenly to mock passers-by, never actually laughing, just breathing quietly, his eyes following each guest as they slipped inside. When we got to the entrance, he leaned into my personal space. I remember flinching backward because I could smell him. Sweat and something else, like rotten fruit. He whispered something I didn't catch. It might have been nonsense, or maybe my own name. Though how would he know my name? I told myself I'd misheard. Lisa noticed the tension in my shoulders and pulled me back. The clown's eyes flicked to her and then to Mark, as if measuring us. Eventually he stepped aside, letting us enter, a thin grin tugging at the corners of his painted mouth. Inside, the funhouse was the usual gauntlet of warped mirrors and wobbly floors, dim flashing lights and cheap animatronic scares. Mark and Janet tried to laugh it off, making jokes to lighten the mood, but I could tell Lisa was shaken. Danny stayed quiet. We stumbled through mirrored corridors that made our reflections stretch unnaturally. I kept expecting the clown to jump out from behind a corner, but we never saw him again inside. Still, it felt like he was with us somehow. A strange smell lingered in one tunnel, sharp and chemical, stinging my nostrils. I tried not to think about it, telling myself it was just stale carnival props. When we finally pushed through the exit flaps back into the warm night air, none of us said anything for a moment. Mark broke the silence with a laugh. Man, that clown was messed up. Lisa just shook her head. That didn't feel right, she said softly. Danny lit a cigarette, eyes downcast. Janet nodded. I've seen a lot of cheap scares, but that guy was, I don't know, real. We drifted away from the funhouse, blending back into the crowd, and after a while the tension faded. Another day, another silly attraction. Eventually we parted ways and went home. A few days later, I was watching the evening news with my parents. I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor, popping pieces of stale gum into my mouth, half listening, half daydreaming. Suddenly, the anchor's tone changed, grave and urgent. Something about a fugitive wanted in connection to a double homicide. A suspect last spotted at a traveling carnival that had passed through several states, leaving local authorities stumped. I leaned forward, heart thumping. The news crew showed a police sketch, and I almost choked. It looked just like him. The clown at the funhouse, the cheekbones, the hollow eyes. He'd killed 2 people before vanishing into thin air, and now the cops suspected he'd been moving with the carnival crowds. He hadn't been hired. He had no affiliation with the carnival at all. He'd simply put on a costume and blended in, taunting teenagers like us, all while staying one step ahead of the law. My mouth went dry. I called Mark immediately. He was watching the same broadcast. Lisa, on the extension, started to cry. Danny, when I tried his number, let it ring. We knew. We'd been so close to him, close enough to smell his breath, to hear his raspy whisper. Close enough that if he'd decided any of us looked interesting enough to follow after dark, maybe we'd never have made it out of that funhouse at all. Over the next few days, the entire town seemed to buzz with disbelief and horror. Parents were furious with the carnival owners, who insisted they had no idea. The authorities launched more manhunts in neighboring states. I heard from a friend of a friend that the killer was finally caught a few weeks later, but I never confirmed it. I didn't really want to know the details. The damage to my sense of safety was already done. For years, I had nightmares about that face, about him leaning in too close. In the dreams, I couldn't move, couldn't run. He'd just stare, breathing quietly, and I'd realize I was alone in that maze of mirrors, no friends in sight. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding. It's strange how something that seemed like a harmless teenage adventure can linger over your entire adult life. I can still smell that pungent, rotten fruit odor if I let my mind drift back too far. I can still feel the press of humid summer air on my skin. Still hear that low, tinny laughter playing on a loop outside the funhouse. We never went back to a traveling carnival, none of us. Not Mark, not Lisa, not Janet, and not Danny. I think Danny moved away after graduation. I barely remember saying goodbye. We all just drifted apart. Life went on. But even now, decades later, I cannot set foot near those neon tents and makeshift rides without wondering who might be lurking behind the face paint, who might be hiding in plain sight, waiting quietly for the perfect moment to lean in close and whisper something, meant only for me. You can say what you want about the old days, the 1990s, the innocence of small-town life. But I know better. Monsters are not always in the stories we tell. Sometimes they stand right beside us, dressed like everyone else, passing us in a crowd on a warm summer night. And that, to me, is the most terrifying thing of all. I remember it clearly. late November of 2018, when the nights in my little apartment complex felt oddly still. It was the kind of place where you knew your neighbors by their coughs through thin walls, but not their faces. I had moved in just a few months prior, drawn to the building's low rent and the tired promise of quiet tenants the landlord boasted about. At the time, I didn't appreciate how silence can feel less like peace and more like a predator waiting in the dark. The complex itself was forgettable. Beige walls stained with years of cigarette smoke, dim hallways that always smelled faintly of damp carpet. A place meant to house people passing through life, not staying. My one-bedroom unit faced an alley lined with dumpsters, the kind of view that seemed to demand you lower your expectations. But it was mine. After years of roommates and shared spaces, I liked having control over the locks, the routines. I worked a 9-to-5 job back then, nothing glamorous. Data entry for a small shipping company. It was just enough to keep the lights on and build up a modest savings account. Each night I returned home exhausted, cooked something quick, and collapsed in front of the TV. My routine was a shield, steady, predictable, and that predictability soothed an anxiety I'd carried since childhood. Back then, I thought predictability meant safety. I couldn't have been more wrong. It started on a Tuesday night. I woke from a dreamless sleep at 2 a.m. sharp, startled by a noise I couldn't place at first. In my groggy confusion, I held my breath, straining to hear beyond the faint hum of my refrigerator. Then, there it was again. A soft, deliberate tapping on my apartment door. Not a knock, not a desperate pounding, just a measured, persistent tap, tap, tap. I stayed perfectly still. My heart climbed into my throat. Half asleep, I tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a neighbor, confused about which door was theirs. Maybe someone drunk or high. I told myself not to overreact. After all, I didn't want to be the crazy new tenant calling the cops because someone knocked once. The tapping stopped. Silence settled again like a heavy blanket, and I forced myself back to bed. I convinced myself it had been nothing. But it wasn't. When it happened again the next night, I was wide awake. The tapping began at 2 a.m. on the dot, louder this time. 3 deliberate taps, a pause, and then 3 more. My skin prickled. I didn't want to move, didn't want whoever it was to hear me. But curiosity overpowered fear, and I crept to the door, barefoot and silent. The hallway light filtered weakly through the peephole. At first I saw nothing, but as my eyes adjusted to the fisheye lens, I froze. A face filled the view, pale and distorted, a clown mask. The red, exaggerated mouth, the wide black eyes, the cheap plastic sheen. He was so close to the peephole that I could see the texture of the mask, the tiny factory-made creases. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Just stood there, staring through the lens like he could see me on the other side. I backed away, chest heaving, and sat down on the floor. I couldn't make sense of it. A prank? Someone drunk? But who stands that still? My hands trembled as I locked the deadbolt and chained the door. He didn't knock again. When I finally gathered the courage to look through the peephole, he was gone. The next morning, I asked my neighbors if they'd seen anything strange. The older woman in the unit next to mine, Mrs. Kalinsky, squinted at me from behind a chain latch. "Strange? You mean like the pipes banging?" she asked. "They've been doing that for weeks." "No, I mean footsteps in the hall, or someone knocking on doors late at night." Her face darkened. I heard something like that. Thought it was the maintenance guy. But I didn't look. Why? I hesitated. There was someone wearing a clown mask outside my door. Her lips tightened. Probably just kids. You know, the neighborhood isn't what it used to be. A younger neighbor down the hall, Tom, shrugged when I asked. Weirdos are everywhere, man. Just ignore it. He said it so casually, like being stalked was a normal inconvenience. That night, I couldn't relax. I left my hallway light on, checked the locks twice, and stayed awake long after midnight. When the tapping began at 2 a.m., I nearly screamed. It was louder now, harder, insistent, like whoever was on the other side was testing the door's strength. I grabbed my phone and called the police, keeping my voice low. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She said an officer would come by, but the minutes dragged like hours. Meanwhile, the tapping continued. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Finally, silence. When the officers arrived, the hallway was empty. They checked the stairwells, the basement, and the main entrance. No one. No signs of forced entry. If it happens again, call us right away, they said, as though it were no big deal. The next day, my landlord, Claudia, called me into her office. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s with frazzled hair and perpetually tired eyes. I'd never seen her look so serious. I got your message about the knocking, she said. So I checked the security footage. My stomach dropped. Claudia gestured to a tiny monitor on her desk, hooked up to grainy black and white feeds from the building's old cameras. She rewound to 1:50 a.m. the previous night. There, emerging from the basement stairwell, was the clown. He moved slowly, hugging the walls, his stiff shoulders giving him an uncanny puppet-like gait. We watched him pause at each apartment door, leaning in as though listening for movement. He reached my door, raised a gloved hand, and tapped. Then he just stood there, tilting his head slightly, as though savoring the silence. He's coming in through the basement, Claudia muttered. That damn door's been left open again. She called the police with the footage and installed a heavy new deadbolt on the basement door that afternoon. I should have felt safer. I didn't. That Friday, I woke again at 2 a.m., but this time it wasn't tapping. It was louder. A sound like someone pressing their full weight against the door, testing it. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept to the peephole. He was there, closer than ever. His mask filled the lens, the red mouth twisted into a permanent grin. I could see the plastic edges pressing against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. He didn't move. He didn't speak. I thought he was going to break in. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped back. His stiff, unnatural movements made it look like he was being pulled by invisible strings. He tilted his head, lingered for a moment, and walked back toward the stairwell. I moved out 2 months later. I couldn't live with the constant fear. Even though the clown never returned, at least not to my door, the paranoia lingered. Every creak in my new apartment made me jump. Every knock sent my heart racing. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see his mask pressed against the peephole, the painted grin, the silence. Not all horror comes from ghosts or monsters. Sometimes, the scariest thing is just a man with a mask and the time to wait. And if you're lucky, you never find out what he really wanted. It's been years since we fled that house, but I still can't talk about what happened without breaking into a sweat. I'm sharing this because I think people deserve to know that not all monsters look inhuman. Some just wear a painted smile. It was late September 2013 when we moved into that suburban home. The kind of place you dream about when you're young and broke. A neatly trimmed lawn, a maple tree out front, and a quiet street where kids could ride bikes without fear of speeding cars. It felt like we'd finally made it. My husband Adam and I had scrimped and saved for years, working late shifts and skipping vacations so we could give our 6-year-old son Oliver a real home. And now here we were, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the giddy exhaustion of starting fresh. "This is it," Adam had said, smiling as he carried me over the threshold in mock honeymoon fashion. I laughed, swatting at his shoulder, and Oliver followed behind, holding his favorite stuffed dinosaur. That moment felt like the beginning of something good, something safe. The first oddity was small, barely worth mentioning. On the second day of unpacking, I opened a kitchen cabinet and found a bright red foam nose, the kind you'd see on a cheap party clown. I laughed and showed it to Adam. "Creepy," he said with a chuckle. "Maybe the old owners were circus folk." I tossed it in the trash and didn't think much of it. But then over the next week, we found more. A faded wig in a tangled heap under the bathroom sink. A pair of enormous, filthy clown shoes shoved behind the water heater in the basement. Once, I noticed faint white streaks on the inside of a bedroom closet, like someone had tried to scrub off smeared face paint but given up. "It's like someone left their nightmare behind," Adam joked, trying to lighten the mood. We laughed it off together, but I noticed the way he lingered on the clown shoes before throwing them into the garbage bin. A faint unease had begun to settle in, like a draft slipping under the door. Oliver's complaints started soon after. "I don't like my room," he whispered one night as I tucked him in. "It's just because it's new, sweetheart," I said, smoothing his hair. "You'll get used to it." "No, it's not that," he said, clutching his dinosaur tighter. "I hear stuff. Creaks like someone walking." "It's an old house, Ollie," I reassured him. "Houses make noises. It's just the wood settling or the wind. I promise." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Later that night, Adam and I heard it too. Soft, deliberate footsteps in the upstairs hallway. Not the random creaks of wood expanding, but slow, purposeful steps. Adam sat up in bed, his head cocked to the side like a dog hearing a distant sound. "You hear that, right?" I whispered. He nodded and slipped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand. I followed him as he checked the locks, the windows, the closets, every inch of the house. Nothing. Always nothing. But the footsteps continued on random nights, just often enough to keep us on edge. A week later, I mentioned the clown items to our neighbor, Mrs. Harding, as we chatted over the fence. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a brisk manner. "Did you meet the previous owners?" I asked casually, wiping dirt from my hands as I pulled weeds. Her face tightened immediately. "No, but I heard things. They had problems." "What kind of problems?" She hesitated, her gaze flitting toward our house. "You should talk to the police," she said finally, then turned back to pruning her roses. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, like she knew something, but didn't want to be the one to say it. That night, I called the local police station. I told the officer I wasn't reporting a crime, just curious if there had been any incidents at our address. His tone changed immediately, becoming cautious. "Well," he said, "there were a few reports of a trespasser, a man in a clown mask. The family said he was tapping on their windows at night, leaving strange items in the yard. He'd disappear before officers arrived. They eventually moved out. My stomach dropped. Did you ever catch him? No, the officer admitted, but there haven't been any recent reports. Maybe he moved on. I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling. Adam tried to reassure me, but I could tell he was shaken too. We replaced the locks that weekend, adding deadbolts and a security bar to the sliding glass door. The nightmares began after that. Oliver would wake in tears, unable to describe what had frightened him except for a face with a big red smile. I'd hold him until he calmed down, but every night it got harder to tell myself it was just a phase. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke to a soft scraping sound, like fabric brushing against the wall. At first, I thought it was a dream. Then I heard the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps in the hallway. My breath hitched, and I reached over to shake Adam awake. His eyes snapped open, alert. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Together, we crept into the hallway, the dim glow from our bedroom casting long shadows across the floor. At Oliver's door, I paused, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. Adam stepped in front of me and pushed it open. The sight made my heart stop. A figure stood by the window, tall and lanky, wearing a stained plastic clown mask. The paint was chipped, revealing yellowed plastic beneath, and the grin was cracked, giving it an even more grotesque look. In his hand, he held something small and dark. Oliver's stuffed dinosaur. Oliver was curled up in bed, eyes wide, frozen with terror. He didn't make a sound. The intruder turned to us, his head cocking to the side like a curious dog. For a moment, none of us moved. Then, with a sudden jerk, he bolted, flinging the window open and climbing out onto the roof. Adam lunged forward, shouting, but by the time he reached the window, the man was gone. We heard a heavy thud as he landed somewhere below, then silence. I grabbed Oliver and held him tight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He buried his face in my shoulder, his small body shaking. Adam called the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was long gone. They found no fingerprints, no footprints, no sign of forced entry. Just the open window and Oliver's dinosaur, abandoned on the roof. We left the house the next day. Some people might call that dramatic, but I didn't care. Staying felt like inviting him back. Within a month, we'd sold the place, losing money but gaining peace of mind. The police never caught him. I don't even know if they looked very hard. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, lurking in another family's yard, leaving strange items behind, waiting for someone to notice. I wonder if they'll laugh it off the way we did. If they'll shrug and toss the red nose into the trash, not realizing they've just become the next chapter in his twisted game. All I know is this: not all horrors wear supernatural faces. Sometimes, the scariest monsters are the ones who stare at you through a cracked plastic mask, their painted smile hiding intentions you'll never understand. And they're real.